Good morning. Welcome to the 24th meeting of the committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to switch off their mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please? And can you make sure it's switched off and not on silent, because it does affect the microphones. Agenda item 1 is a declaration of interest for new members. Can I start by welcoming Cameron Buchanan to the committee? It's your first committee meeting, but you've already been with the committee in Dundee last week, and you're more than welcome. Do you have anything to declare?
Nothing to declare. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Agenda item 2 is to agree whether to consider item 5 on the agenda and a draft committee memorandum in private. Are we all agreed? Can I also seek the committee's agreement to consider our approach to our work programme in private at our next meeting? Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. Agenda item 3 is an evidence-taking session on our inquiry into the delivery of regeneration in Scotland. Before we move on to oral evidence today, I'd like to say that on Monday of last week, committee members undertook 2 more community fact-finding visits as part of our inquiry. This brings to 6 the number of fact-finding visits we have undertaken around Scotland on this work, and I estimate we have now directly engaged with nearly 200 local community representatives since we began our inquiry in January. I, along with Richard Baker, Cameron Buchanan and Stuart Stevenson, visited Whitfield and Dundee to meet with local community groups. At the same time, the Deputy Convener John Wilson, Anne McTaggart and Stuart McMillan visited Fergusley Park and Paisley for the same purpose. Between these 2 visits, we engaged with another 70 local people from communities across Scotland. I'd like to thank all those local people who took the time to meet with us, as well as staff from Dundee City Council, the Whitfield Development Group, East Renfrewshire Council, Engage Renfrewshire and the Fergusley Park Housing Association for all of their assistance in helping to facilitate these visits. And I'll correct myself now, because it shouldn't be East Renfrewshire Council, it should be Renfrewshire Council. We have 3 panels of witnesses before us today representing urban regeneration companies and local authorities and enterprise agencies. We will conclude the session today by hearing from Minister Margaret Burgess on behalf of the Scottish Government. The witnesses before us today have made written submissions, which members have in papers. Can I welcome Ian Manson, Chief Executive of Clyde Gateway, Alan Robertson, Projects Director of Clydebank Rebuilt, Patrick Wiggins, Chief Executive of the Irvine Bay Regeneration Company, and Eric Adair, Director of Park Craigmillar. I am conscious of time limitations today. Can I ask, gentlemen, do you have any brief opening statements that you'd like to make? And they will have to be very brief.
Just to say thank you very much. Clyde Gateway is very keen to contribute to your inquiry. And you've had a number of witnesses over the last few sessions as well who have represented Clyde Gateway. You've maybe not realised that. You've had Councillor Chris Thompson, who was our Vice Chair here recently, Brendan Rooney from Healthy and Happy, and Jimmy McClelland, one of our community representatives. So very glad you've had them. Clyde Gateway, you toured our area around about a year ago, and if you were to tour again today, you would see an area under major transformation. We have a good story to tell, but we have a long way to go in terms of finishing off that job. I'm very happy to have made a submission to you today that says that the community should be at the heart of regeneration, that it's a long haul doing the job well, that upfront public money is required to get it going, and of course we all have to convince the private sector to invest so that the jobs we all desire can be created.
Thank you, Mr Manson. Regards to everyone in your organisation, and particular to wee Jimmy, who I think we all who came across him thought was an amazing witness. Any other comments, gentlemen? Okay, thank you. In which case we'll move straight on to the questions. Can I ask you how your organisation responded to the financial crisis? And did you alter projections and targets at that time? Will we start with you, Mr Manson?
Thank you very much. Well, we were born into the storm. Clyde Gateway was created in 2008, so from the very beginning, our tactics, our strategy and our operating plans were amended to take into account the poor market conditions we found. So as you would expect, previous assumptions around values, around joint ventures, around the state of the private sector market were altered from day one. And the tactics that Clyde Gateway adopted at that time were to identify early projects to make sure there was early wins, because that was going to be even more difficult than it was before, and to get early action on the ground in the face of what we knew was a crisis, but also to have a number of market opportunities ready, because at that time it was difficult to guess which aspects of the market were going to come back or going to develop. So we put a range of opportunities out into the market. So unfortunately for Clyde Gateway, it was a day one issue, and Clyde Gateway has continued constantly to upgrade, to review the position, to decide what to do in the face of a changing market conditions. We did adhere to our original targets, and that might be of interest to the committee. It was very much felt by our board that at the very first meeting, in effect, to reduce or amend the targets in any way would not be the right thing to do. So over a 20-year period, we still intend 400,000 square metres of business space, 10,000 houses to be built in our area. And that will, of course, 20-year period cover a number of recessions and economic good times. So the board has reviewed its position constantly, but it's continued to pursue ambitious targets for the future of our area. And of course, on the back of the M74 completion investment and the legacy ambitions around the Commonwealth Games, we still feel that's the right thing to do.
So you were born during the beginning of the downturn. So were your targets initially much more realistic then, if that was the time period that you came?
The targets were set in a business planning process that took the two years, 2006 and 7. So you could quite easily say, were these still realistic given the changed economic circumstances? But the key thing to remember about Clyde Gateway is that it's a 20-year commitment. So these targets will be met because the fundamentals are there. There is room and land, and when we finished infrastructure, to accommodate that level of investment and outcomes. So over a 20-year period, we feel the right thing to do is to stick to these targets. So they still are realistic in our view.
Okay, we may come back to that. Mr. Robertson?
Yes, thank you, Convener. We were born at a different time to our respective colleagues. That our initial business plan was the period 2003 to 2010, so we were both sides of the fence with regards to the good times and the deteriorating times. We refreshed our business plan in 2010 and very much took account of the wider circumstances, and as a result pared back some of our targets with regards to the creation of business space and also certain jobs targets. For example, in the period 2010, we had identified that we would like to try and achieve something of the order of 14,400 square metres of business space in our area. The reality by 2010 was 5,700. So as a result, going forward in the planned period 2010 to 2016, we only marginally increased the cumulative target from the 14,000 up to 15,550. On the construction job side of things, initially we had hoped for something of the order of 420 jobs. We, in actual fact, had achieved 65 by 2010 and again pared back. So the cumulative target 2016 is 139 construction-related jobs.
Sir Wiggins.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We were, I guess, born at the end of a last period of growth, or significant period of growth. So we've made significant changes to our business plan over the last few years. And in our submission to you, we've got a diagram which shows a number of iterations that we've been through. And I think we've responded in a number of different ways. One, yes, of course, we've taken account of the recession, the impact that's had, particularly in terms of commercial development and investment from the private sector. We've also taken account of the squeeze on public finances, some of the original ambitions in terms of our business plan, in terms of the level of funding we could secure from the public sector. We've pared back because we understand that's no longer either appropriate or available. We've also looked very closely with our partners about how all of the partners respond to the economic crisis that has hit North Ayrshire. So through the community planning process, through the North Ayrshire economic development and regeneration strategy, there's been quite a shift in terms of the emphasis that all the partners are playing in terms of job creation. So if you look at our original jobs target, it was something in the region of 1,100 jobs. And that was because what we were trying to do at that point was create the setting for investment and doing a lot of urban renewal work. We've now shifted quite fundamentally to look at more opportunistic-based job creation opportunities on the back of the work of the Economic Development and Regeneration Strategy for North Ayrshire, and of course taking advantage of the opportunity that we have with the enterprise area. So we've recalibrated what we're doing, and we're still very optimistic about our ability to pull in the jobs that we want to achieve, and actually we've increased our jobs target because of the enterprise area opportunity, for example. So we're trying to balance different things. We've shifted our emphasis. We put far more emphasis now on job creation opportunities than we had originally, and that's a reflection both of the needs of the area, the views of the Community Planning Partnership, the views of our main sponsors in terms of Scottish Enterprise and North Ayrshire Council, and the opportunity that we have through the enterprise area. And that's a unique opportunity for us as a URC to have to deliver.
Mr Adair.
Park Craig Miller developed its business plan over the periods 2003, 4, 5, which were clearly very buoyant economic circumstances. And the vision, the goals, the objectives were developed out of those circumstances, with a view that by around 2007, 8 or 9, the whole enterprise would effectively be self-sufficient. It should be proceeding on the basis of the profitability of the previous investment and through private sector normal bank lending, in simple terms. Of course, by late 2008, fundamentally there were very limited, if any, profits to be made from development, and bank lending had disappeared. So the two fundamental features of the second phase of park regeneration were effectively not in place. Therefore, from 2009 on, we were not able to pursue at any pace the original objectives. By the end of 2009, the company was technically insolvent. Its liabilities exceeded its assets, and we were in the mode of many of the private sector development companies at that time, which was effectively survival, with a question whether survival was indeed possible. So while we held on to our vision, we effectively really had to drop many of our short-term targets and alter those targets from investment for the long term to anything which would enable the company to generate cash in the short term. Our view was that if we did not survive, then we would be unable to achieve the long-term objectives. So survival became the focus of our activities, and has been until very recently. And only the beginnings of improvements in bank lending and in the economy in the last 12 months mean that we are returning again to look at our longer-term vision.
Okay, I have a number of colleagues who want to come in, but before I take in Anne McTaggart first, on page 4 of Irvin Bay's submission, it says that £500 million of gross value added has been secured so far. Could the other organisations give us an indication of where they're at in that regard? Mr Manson.
Just a slight,
Mr Wigan.
Okay, just a slight correction. What we're saying is that actually the amount secured isn't that high. What we believe from the work that we're doing, it can lead to that level of GVA. So if that's slightly confusing in that table, I apologise, but just for clarity.
So thus far then?
Thus far, we've secured 7 million thus far.
Out of, and how much public money has been invested?
Oh, out of public money invested, 33 million. £33
million of public money invested, and thus far the GVA is 7 million.
Yes, but the projects that we're working on, we believe, will generate substantially more, because what we're doing at the moment is putting in place the infrastructure which will lead to the private sector investment, which will lead to the GVA. So that's why in the figures there we're showing that there's amount secured and the amount which will be secured on the back of the work that we've started and commenced. So for example, the enterprise area will lead to very significant amounts of GVA and is already beginning to do so.
Okay. Mr. Manson?
Yes, thank you. GVA predictions form part of the business planning process for Clyde Gateway. So the expected GVA was part of the outcome from the investment, the expected investment. We use GVA predictions on a project-by-project basis to decide whether a project is good value in terms of going forward. But we have not calculated GVA outcomes so far cumulatively for our projects. That's something we're very happy to do, but it's not an indicator that we have available at the moment.
The committee would be very interested in seeing that. Obviously, if you're doing it for individual projects, I would imagine it would be quite easy to add all of that up. Mr. Robertson.
Like Mr. Manson, that's not figures that we have immediately to hand. The intention was that it would be clarified towards the end of the business plan, which would have been 2016. So it's a case of the upfront investment from the Urban Regeneration Company and partners goes in, gets things moving, and thereafter the private sector investment is attracted, and that was when we believed was the appropriate time to be measuring it. But like Mr. Manson, if the committee is looking for further details, happy to look into that.
The committee most certainly is looking for further detail, and we'd be grateful if you could pass that on to the clerks. Mr. Adair?
Similarly, we haven't been using GVA as a particular measure. Equivalent, perhaps, figures which we do have, however, would be that for £26 million of grant investment, we have levered in another £38 million of private sector finance.
Okay, thank you very much. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. I'm going to ask about community involvement now. Good morning, panel, sorry. In the joint submission from the West Coast URCs, you know that we have provided and will continue to provide money and people resources to support the establishment and operation of community groups. Yeah, do you all remember writing that? Could each of you provide us with more detail in respect of the numbers, the roles and investment your organisations have made in these community groups and the impact this has had on the local community regeneration?
Mr. Adair, would you like to start?
Referring to submission from the West Coast,
Yeah.
so obviously that doesn't include Park Craigmillar. We have supported the local neighbourhood partnership for the existence of Park Craigmillar. We've effectively been supporting their role as a liaison to the community. And so we have contributed, I would think on average, £20,000 a year towards that. We also contributed in the sense of part of our management team. We had for a number of years, a full-time community liaison officer. We have also, through sponsorship, supported many of the local community groups. I wouldn't know off the top of my head what the cost of that or the involvement in that had been.
Mr. Wiggins?
Yes, there's a number of sort of roles we play in terms of engagement and support with the community. There's a number of specific projects which we've engaged in. So, for example, Winning Community Sports Club. We've worked with them over a number of years. We've put in around about £200,000, and that's allowed them to secure a £2 million investment in terms of the refurbishment of their activities and their training facilities and so on and so forth. We've also worked with an organisation, again, in Kilwinning called Pride, Pennyburn Regeneration Youth Development Enterprise, where they took an old pub and they've received some grant support from lottery and so on. We've added about £50,000 to £60,000 to that pot, which has enabled them to transform that old derelict building into a vibrant centre for youth, for training, for enterprise, for other community events. Historically, we've also done a number of different things in terms of community engagement. It might be worth just touching on. For example, each of our towns, we have a town regeneration plan, for example, and we've made sure that community engagement and consultation is right at the heart of developing those plans. So in the events we ran, over 800 people, members of the public, were engaged in that process. We have annual public meetings and so on and so forth. So there's a full community engagement program there as well. And I think one of the interesting things that we've been able to do is reach out through a schools program. So we have, we link into the community, can't remember the title, the new education programs for excellence, curriculum for excellence, sorry, forgive me. So, you know, around about 5,000 school children across our patch have been involved in different projects linking into our regeneration work. We've established something called a Youth Regeneration Forum, where senior people from the secondary schools come together and they help contribute to different projects that we work on and put ideas into how we deliver those projects. And finally, so another, I think, is a really interesting example is Winning Town Centre, where we made a very substantial investment there. What we did is that we used that youth program to engage in the design of the streetscape works. We worked with the Promoting Kewinning group, who are the traders who are looking to promote Kewinning and get more business into the area. And they specifically affected the design of what we were putting forward, so they could have run events and host more activities in the town centre. We also worked with a local archaeological group, and that's become a nationally recognised success story through Heritage Lottery, celebrating the history of Kilwinning, and something like 300 volunteers involved in an archaeological dig in the centre of Kilwinning, all adding to the vibrancy of what we're trying to achieve and deliver. And as a result of that, that's been a much more successful public realm scheme than I think we even would have hoped for at the start of the process.
Mr Robertson.
Thank you, Convener. Clydebank Rebuilt obtained £196,000 towards public consultation, and one of the main elements of how we took that forward was to establish our own community-based group known as the Design Forum. Now, that was very much an opportunity for existing community representatives to come forward, but most importantly, members of the public to attend what, for all intents and purposes, were public meetings. Now, that allowed everyone who attended to meet with Clydebank Rebuilt in understanding what our plans and proposals were, and most importantly, our professional teams who were working on specific projects. And as a result of that, there are a number of particularly heritage-related considerations. I'm sure the committee will be aware that there's a great deal of pride in Clydebank in terms of the Singer sewing machine factory and also the shipbuilding. So through these forums, it was made very clear to us that that should be respectfully noted in the designs that we were taking forward. To date, we've had 16 forums. Everyone who attends receives a report of the forum. It also goes up onto our website, and we always had substantial local press coverage both in advance of the meetings and then subsequently. As part of the consultation exercise, we also met, of course, with the business community, because sometimes when you're meeting with local community, the assumption is that it's particularly local residents, but we felt it was especially important, given the economic situation, that business owners and managers were also involved. Just to finish on the Design Forum, I think the other thing is part and parcel of community aspirations for their regeneration of the town was to make very clear to us, and the committee may have seen the substantial press coverage that we got for a major International Heritage Awards just a number of weeks back. The community made clear something needs to be done with the crane, it needs to be reused, and also they were very concerned about the state of the town centre. So based on these aspirations and requirements from the community, we've undertaken projects valued at £7 million. So that's the larger, probably more set piece elements, and I think it was 2008 that our community engagement activities were recognised by the Scottish Government as representing good practice. But there's also the more informal side of things where, and I've got to say it's not large amounts of money, but perhaps a few £100 here, £1,000 there, to community interests that are looking to take forward some of their own projects. And a for example would be a number of individuals who approached us and wanted to improve local sports facilities. So what we were able to do was provide them with some initial funding to do some very preliminary feasibility work, but in terms of how that's progressed over the years, a community sports trust has been formed, a business plan has been written, and lottery funding is being applied for.
Answer.
Thank you. The community is at the heart of everything that Clyde Gateway does. So a healthy community is absolutely vital to the regeneration of the entire area. So it's a key component of everything we do. We are supporting some of the most deprived communities in Scotland, very fragile communities who need support all the way through the process, and we give our support through our own resources, through grants, through support of our own staff and various other ways. The key way we do this is through support to 3 community development trusts who are independent bodies who are intended to support the community going forward, particularly in the ownership of assets and long-term sustainable community development. And these trusts, I'm glad to say, have already been successful. You had Brendan Rooney here, and the support that we've given his organisation has allowed him to lever in around about £500,000 of additional investment, and the Kilmarnock People's Trust has levered in additional £1 million of additional investment that wouldn't have come to the area without them. I've got a couple of figures here just to give you an idea of the scale of what we do. In the Cumlachie community, we spent £185,000 so far on capacity building, youth diversity activities, health and employability work and outreach work. In the Kilmarnock community, £100,000 to establish the trust, a community shop, an allotment and also capacity building. And finally in Burnhill, which was described to the committee before, £276,000 to support Healthy and Happy's activities, which are about outreach, financial inclusion and jobs. So successful regeneration has to encompass that sort of work, and that we would like to continue that sort of direct investment in our communities as long as we can.
Yeah. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I just want to explore your decision-making process in relation to the projects you undertake. And let me just start by asking an obvious question, and a nodding head answer will do, I suspect. Do you have more projects than you can do?
Rather
just a nodding head. I take it that would be true for you all. Right, okay, that's money in the bank, questioning terms. We heard from the panel various slightly different approaches to the financial appraisal of projects. I want on that first to ask just a couple of questions. Do you use the financial appraisal to rank projects? And do you have a return on investment or other measure that you use in deriving that rank? And do you have a minimum figure that a project would have to exceed before you would consider it in financial terms? And to give a context to that, I'm absolutely understanding that we do the physical regeneration, the spending of money to deliver societal benefits. So it is a complex question, but I'm focusing on finance. Whoever starts first.
Mr. Manson.
Yes, happy to respond to that. Yes, our projects are scored, they're ranked, and our board makes a decision about what goes forward into the operating plan every year. We use our KPIs in terms of ranking them, so projects which have a major impact against our overall 20-year outcomes are obviously those which go forward. It's an interesting point you raise on finance, because we have projects in our operating plan which we hope the private sector will finance. One of the things Clyde Gateway does is de-risk projects. At one extreme, we don't succeed in de-risking it, and we have to consider direct provision by ourselves using our own resources. But success for us is when we have sufficiently de-risked a project, i.e. invested in land reclamation, designed a building, found an occupier, found a development partner, where public money at the end of the day is not required. So the finance question is probably more complicated than even you expect, because once you've ranked it and said, well, will we finance this? It's then our job as a team to go out and make sure that we don't have to finance it. And the best example of how that happened was our Eastgate office development, where the committee stood in the atrium last year. And although that was in our operating plan, at the top, ranked and financed, we secured Aviva's 100% funding of that. And in fact, we made a return on that building. So it's rather more of a complex process. But where it's public money at stake, everything follows the various appraisal and public sector finance manuals in terms of value for money and justification.
Robertson.
If I could suggest that it's actually rather awkward for me to directly answer the question, because what you suggested is a very quantitative approach to how the projects are identified. What I would say is our modus operandi has been more qualitative, and if I may just briefly explain the background as to our URC's operation. When we were first set up, the intention was that we would be working closely with the private sector on a number of key sites within Clydebank. Due to circumstances which time doesn't permit me to go into, that's not happened, and we were able to secure.
You know, in terms of the circumstances, if we're talking about the economic downturn, please say that. If there are other circumstances which stopped the progression of some of these projects, I think we'd like to know that.
Okay. Primarily economic downturn, convener. So we were able to secure land that we had, and what we've recognised that perhaps historically in redevelopment and regeneration initiatives, that sites are prepared and then they're left to their own fortunes, and sometimes it can take many years. So we very much took the approach that what we would do is build directly, and that has been the focus of our efforts over the years since we were first formed. So in many ways, the activity that we have undertaken has been internal, where we've been building directly, and what we have done is the projects that we've been proposing taking forward, particularly developing economic infrastructure, has been passed through the operational plan by our board and indeed our funders.
Mr. Wiggins.
Yeah, I think this echoes some of the comments made by Ian. We probably go through a three-stage process in effect. We've not sort of mapped it out that way, but when we undertake a fundamental review of the business plan, we go through a full ranking and prioritization process, which looks at finance, it looks at outputs, looks at risks, looks at deliverability, looks at environmental considerations. And that gives us like a long list of projects, which we then passport into our annual operating plan. And again, when we go through the operating plan, we look at the affordability, we look at the deliverability, and we look at the projects which we think are going to deliver the biggest impact and the best return we can get. And then when we get the sign-off of the individual projects, some of that process is actually repeated. And we take a very sort of hard look at terms of commercial assessments of the projects. We understand there's lots of risks in the projects that we're dealing with. And we understand also that there's severe market failure. So there's not always a financial return. In fact, there's very rarely a financial return as such, because we're having to subsidize projects to get them going. We also have a range of projects where actually our financial input is really relatively low, because what we're trying to do is prepare the ground and create the conditions for private sector investment. So it's not always the quantum of finance going in at the front. There's also partnership work, there's enabling work, there's facilitation work, there's engagement with the private sector, for example, which is a long-term process in the current economic circumstances, which we believe will deliver significant investment in the future and very high returns.
Mr. Adair.
There's no one approach that Park Craigmillar has used. It has varied both in terms of the phasing of the overall project, overall regeneration, and it has varied depending on the particular project. A lot of the early projects that we undertook were to change the perception and to create the position for longer term development. So for example, if we invested money in one of our early key developments was to build 2 new primary schools, because our view was that that changed the perception for the local community. It made a statement to the local community. It made a statement to the future, the younger generation who would be hopefully stay in the area in the length of time that we were doing the regeneration, and it made a statement across the city. There was no direct financial return associated with that investment. Instead, the financial return was expected to be in 20 years' time or beyond that. Similarly, when we were doing greening of the areas, it's difficult to measure the financial return on planting £20,000 worth of daffodils, but there is a significant return in the longer term for that. However, as we moved on and moved to the phase where we were building housing, there we did set financial targets, and we were using industry standard financial returns for housing development, we were seeking to match the returns which a commercial house builder would seek to achieve. However, that was not possible in the early stages. Indeed, if it was possible, then there wouldn't have been a need for regeneration. Fundamentally, it needed to take a different approach. So while that was our benchmark, we recognised that we couldn't achieve the industry accepted benchmark. And so some of our initial housing phases, we were happy if they broke even, and we were trying to improve beyond that. But the goal was then to move towards meeting full industry profitability on housing developments, and then indeed to move beyond that, because we had a goal which was to move the average house price in Craigmillar from around 60% of the Edinburgh average to 80% of the Edinburgh average. And if we could achieve that based on the initial land values, then we would be able to exceed the profitability of normal commercial house building. So we have had to, the process the measurement process of our projects has changed throughout the period of the regeneration and depending on what we were trying to achieve.
Schools aspect of this. 2 new schools, you said. How were they paid for?
Combination of government grant and through our own profitability.
So Edinburgh City Council, in this regard, didn't pay for those schools?
They made a contribution of £1 million towards the school, but Edinburgh Council contributed the land. The vast majority, probably 95% of the land in Craigmillar, is owned by Edinburgh Council. They contribute.
No.
They belong to Edinburgh Council. Or, well, some of them belong to Edinburgh Council. Many of them have moved into private ownership, for example.
No, I'm talking about the schools.
The school is owned by Edinburgh Council.
So rather than paying for those 2 schools by traditional means, Edinburgh Council got you to get various grants, etc. So basically what we have had is a situation where their mainstream budgets have been bypassed, and in other communities throughout Edinburgh, it would be the norm for the council in one way, shape or form to actually build and to pay for those schools. Would that be fair to say?
Yes. In that strict analysis, the council would probably add, however, that it had to put in investment to clear the site, and is still contributing the remaining land to the regeneration of the area.
So it could be said
that
it could be said that your organisation and its ability to go to other bodies to get money has saved Edinburgh City Council from using mainstream resource to build 2 new schools for communities here in Edinburgh.
It could be said, yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Stevenson.
Thank you. As expected by me, we saw from each of you that there are financial considerations and returns, but also societal. And I think the committee is likely to welcome that because we don't simply see this through a financial prism. I'll just close by asking this specific question. For each project you undertake, have you a named and identified person who's responsible for delivering the benefits that were identified when the decision to proceed with the project was made? Because when you take a project forward, you will have in the decision-making process, and it's clear from what you said, this is the case, a set of benefits you expect to be delivered, financial, but also societal. Is there for each project a named and identified person whose job depends on getting those benefits that were in the decision delivered?
Very briefly, gentlemen, Mr. Adair.
Strictly speaking, no, there wouldn't be one named person. Some people would be, if there, a project may have somebody who's responsible for the physical delivery, and so would be expected to therefore probably be responsible for the financial aspects of that. Another individual within the organisation may have been seeking to work with the community on that, so there could have been a range of individuals. But ultimately within the organisation, of course, there is the board of directors who took responsibility for the overall project.
Just before we move on, would you be absolutely clear that the board saw its responsibility as being to deliver all the benefits that are claimed? By the way, I absolutely accept in individual projects there will be things that turn out not to be deliverable, as long as there's a process that makes it clear that what you're discarding and accepting.
Yes, I'm confident that the
Right,
board did
that's fine.
recognise its role and responsibilities.
Yeah, but quite specifically in that way.
Yes.
Right, that's fine.
Yes, we have dedicated project managers assigned to each project, and they're responsible for the life cycle of the project. We do also have...
Can I just stop you there? Because that precisely goes to the nub of what I'm asking. That in a sense, a project differs from a responsibility in that it has a beginning, a middle and an end.
Yes.
Whereas a responsibility has a beginning and endures. And my experience of projects is that when you get to the end, when the project manager leaves the project, it's over the next 20 years, for example, as was suggested by Clyde Gateway, that the benefits are delivered. So how does that benefit cycle get work is my real question.
Okay, I think there's probably two answers to that. One, we have different people who maybe are responsible for the project at different times. So we tend to have a project development manager who will work up the project, maybe do the deal, maybe put in place all the components, and then procure whatever development route we go through. We've also now got an in-house project manager who does the really detailed stuff in terms of project control, scope control, and they look at the whole range of activities which are associated with that project. And then we have our ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So we have the monitoring report, we have the evaluation report, and report back to the board where we are in terms of individual projects, both in terms of our delivery phase, but also where we are in terms of the outputs.
That leaves me unclear. Whose job's on the line if the benefits that were in the decision-making process are not delivered?
Okay, it's mine.
That's fine.
Robertson.
I concur with my colleagues.
That's okay.
Anything further?
Grant. Mr. Manson.
Yes, please, if I can say that you've put your finger on the added value from a focused organisation that lives or dies by its success. So the whole point of my organisation is that it has to produce the goods and it has to produce the outcome. So we're structured in a way that each project has a project manager who sees it all the way through. And there's two things I'd like to add. In some cases, there is specialist knowledge required to make things happen. We have succeeded with community benefits and securing numerous jobs out of construction contracts, and that's a specialist member of staff that we bring to bear. And secondly, the tale that you expressed on this, the 20 years, please don't forget that something significant has happened here, that the bodies that you have in front of you have charitable status in the main, and we have assets. And if these are to be passed on to anybody, then our successor bodies need to have the same aims. So something important has happened here in Scotland, that we now have the resource and the asset within the grasp of the community, and with the flow of further assets going back into that community. So whatever the future of bodies like this, something significant has happened, because a successor body will need to follow through, exploit these assets, and make sure that the communities benefit as we intend.
Richard Baker, please. First question is to Mr. Manson. You said in response to the convener's question that you hadn't had to revise your targets in light of the financial crash, but looking at your key performance indicators, it looks like you're broadly on track to reach your targets. Would that be a fair reflection?
We're satisfied with the indicators in terms of land remediation and some job creation. We are slightly frustrated in terms of commercial development and house building. We'd like to be further ahead on that. But there is a sequence here in terms of our indicators. Quite simply, the area had no sites ready for development 5 years ago. So you won't get the jobs or the housing into the area unless you clean up the sites. So yes, we're on track in terms of cleaning up the sites, but we now need to really motor to get the private investment in that's going to bring the jobs and further investment.
I take that qualification, but it seems to me that compared to the uniform experience, you're closer to your targets, nevertheless, than other regeneration companies are. Now, I've not had the chance to visit the gateway like other members have, so why do you think that might be the case? And is there any learning experience to come in because you started late in other companies, for example?
Well, we obviously did learn from the other Pathfinder companies, and we took our own experience in regeneration over many years. We set out with clear targets and a timescale. That's absolutely vital. You need to have information like that to inspire people. We set out a clear vision for the area, which is shared by local people, and we adopted the local community's common sense priorities: jobs, tidy up the area, get the pollution sorted, and make this the sort of place that people want to live and work. So it's been a very common sense approach, and we have not overpromised, because the history of regeneration in the East End is to overpromise and underdeliver. So we have tried to make sure, it's not perfect, that we take the community with us, we deliver what we say we will, and we have the momentum and the community's confidence in us. And that's a very fragile thing that we work hard on every day to sustain.
My final question, Cunha, is just is more general, because I think that's an interesting comment you made about the common sense approach. And looking forward, I mean, one of the things that's clear is that these projects have 10 to 20 year lifespans. And, you know, looking at what's happened over the past few years with the economic crash, I mean, the future approaches to these schemes going to be revised as a result of that, to take greater account of the ups and downs in the economy. And I'd actually like to start with Mr. Wiggins on this one, because I'm looking at your targets, for example, and you've done quite, you know, reasonably well, I guess, in terms of jobs targets. You created 420 jobs against the original target of 1,100, but now you're going to be an enterprise area as well. You set a revised target of 3,200. Now, looking, for example, at a different target, you had an original target of 1,200 homes, of which 8's been built. I mean, you know, what I'm getting to, convener, here are, you know, is the approach one that's been learned from the past, and our targets being set, which are based on common sense. People aren't being overpromised, and therefore not got a realistic sense of expectation from these very important schemes.
I think, again, what we've done is we've reflected the opportunity that we have with the enterprise area, and there's a huge amount of capacity in the enterprise area, and we've got a one-off opportunity to exploit that, which is why we've shifted our activity very heavily to focus on that. You're right about the original jobs target. At that level, it looks like we're performing pretty well, given the amount of resources we've been able to pull down. But we believe that by redirecting what we're doing, we can achieve more. And the enterprise area status gives us that real sort of USP, which we're looking to exploit. And already we're beginning to get some very good results from that. So we're expecting significant investments. We've already achieved 1 or 2 investments, which will come through in later years in terms of our performance and monitoring and evaluation. On the housing side, yes, I mean, what we've done is that we've got 2 key sites, and all the preparation is now done. So we're ready, we've got development partners in place. It's really about them getting now the finance in place to take forward those schemes. So really what we're doing is that we're continuing to work with those private sector investors. We're trying to support them through the crisis. We're trying to help them find different ways and innovative ways of funding those schemes. But essentially, we're not putting any more money into those schemes. Our emphasis is now very clearly shifting towards the job creation. And again, a bit like Ian's response, if you ask anyone, particularly given the depth of the recession that we've had, what is the priority for the area now? It's jobs. So that's a very clear message that we've taken on board, a very clear realignment of our projects to make sure that we do everything we can to unlock what jobs potential that we have in the area.
Does anybody else want to pick up on Mr. Baker's point? Mr. Robertson.
I could perhaps add, I think without stating the obvious, regeneration areas are very, very difficult to operate in, be it site conditions, be it current economic circumstances that we find ourselves in. But certainly as a URC, I'm quite clear that our job is to crack on. It's about confidence building, it's about making our places attractive and competitive, and really getting them to the start line so that developers and investors, when they come out to play again, that they will very much be looking at areas such as Clydebank and indeed the other regenerations, and that I think is our primary function, is to get us to the start line. Thereafter, and increasingly as an organisation, we are now at the point that we're at the start line and we need the private sector to come in and play their part. That is the future for Clydebank's regeneration.
Before we move on to Mr. Wilson, Mr Manson, you haven't really mentioned the Commonwealth Games to any huge degree in what you've talked about this morning. Is one of the main advantages that you have as a URC the fact that the Commonwealth Games, a lot of the new facilities and the infrastructure is in the east end of Glasgow, in the area that your URC covers?
Yes, apologies if I haven't emphasised that sufficiently. Clearly, the Games Village is a significant part of our housing target. The Emirates Arena is, in business development terms, is a local leisure facility that people can enjoy and use after work. The refurbishment of Kilmarnock Station has been heavily helped by the Commonwealth Games as well. But I have to point out that the M74 completion is equally important. Without accessibility and without the basics being done, the three mainline railway stations improved, then the regeneration that you're seeing simply would not have taken place just with the Commonwealth Games. And a common criticism of regeneration is that having the games isn't enough, building a road isn't enough, building houses isn't enough. And I think Clyde Gateway's response to that is absolutely we agree. This has to be about doing a bit of everything. So the magic of the games, the fact that it has such strong support amongst local people, it's really a game changer in terms of aspiration and hope for the future. And we are taking full advantage of that. But equally, the Commonwealth Games to be successful needs to deliver legacy. And I think Scotland expects and hopes that regeneration of the East End will be one of the key legacies from the Games. So you have a fantastic partnership underway here.
In terms of your targets, if the Commonwealth Games investments had not come into play, where would that have set you in terms of the targets that you originally set yourself?
We would have fundamentally reviewed the targets. If the M74 hadn't been funded and the Commonwealth Games hadn't been won, it's a moot point whether Clyde Gateway itself would have been formed. These decisions were all taken in a very short period around 2007 and 2008. What I like to dwell on is the fact that we have a synergy of a number of important things have happened here. We should not forget that Clyde Gateway was created to make things happen in an area where nothing had been happening for the previous 20 years. We're dealing with long-term market failure here through boom and bust. And what Clyde Gateway has to do is use the games, use the M74 to make a real sea change in the area this time. So there's another world out there where these things didn't happen, and I'm afraid it's all too obvious what would have been going on in the area, which would have been some development, some change, but far from the transformational change that's now underway.
That's very useful, Mr Manson, and it may well be that we will call upon you to provide some of the information that some of us already had at our visit in terms of what that legacy actually will be in terms of housing, etc. So the clerks may write to you to get that information again, to furnish newer members of the committee with that. Mr Wilson.
Convener, if you've left me any questions to ask, because you asked 3 questions that I had written down that I wanted to ask in particular.
That's go on to the second part of that.
Good morning, gentlemen. Can I start off by asking Mr Adair, following on from the convener's question about the schools that were built in Craigmillar, or the plans to build 2 schools, and the current ownership of those schools. And I know you said that 95% of the land belonged to local authority, so therefore you're returning the school back to Edinburgh City Council. Was there any discussion at all about transferring the schools to community ownership and using them as community hubs, rather than just simply transferring them back to, once they've been built, back to the council?
I wasn't employed by Park Craigmillar at the early stages of those decisions, so I don't know whether there were discussions of that nature. My understanding at this point would be no, that was not part of early discussions, but I may be wrong.
The reason why I've raised that question, Convener, is Mr Manson, in one of his responses, indicated that he would expect all the developed through the URC to become community-owned assets. Yeah. Mr Manson, could you define what you mean by community-owned assets? Or is that simply just another situation as what happened in Craigmillar, is that the assets that are created through the public funding that has been ploughed in to the URCs will be transferred to the successor local authorities, in your case, South Lanarkshire Council and Glasgow City Council?
That simple transfer isn't possible. We have an urban regeneration company in our case with charitable status that any successor body has to share the same objectives. So splitting the portfolio up in a very simple way would not be possible unless the successor bodies could demonstrate a continued intention to redevelop the area. So there's a new situation in front of us and one that I find quite exciting.
Just clarify.
Yeah.
The successor organisation would have the same commitment to redevelop the area. Surely the objective of the URC is to actually have the area redeveloped.
Yes.
So there would not be any, or should not be any, based on your current plans, for further redevelopment of the area, because the area should have been redeveloped in the 20-year time span. So therefore, any successor organisation would not have that same objective of redeveloping the area because it should have been redeveloped.
Well, areas change and there will be vacant and derelict land created in the future. So in the east end of Glasgow, there will always be further change to be gathered. But redevelop's perhaps too strong a word. Have the specific interests of the area at heart, and that's something that would have to be embodied in any successor organisations. What I suggested was that assets created by Clyde Gateway could be transferred in that way. The key to that is the attitude of the partners, Scottish Enterprise, South Lanarkshire and Glasgow. They would have to decide how they wanted things taken forward. When I say community ownership, I mean the real thing. The best example I can put in front of you is the Kilmarnock Community Hub, which is in our operating plan to be funded. It's currently undergoing scrutiny by a number of bodies and hopefully to get additional funding in from ERDF and regeneration funding. But that asset will be owned and managed by the People's Development Trust. So I'm quite clear that when I'm talking about community ownership of assets, then it's the real deal. The key factor in this is the community. What do they want to own? What do they want the responsibility for? And I'm quite clear in the moment in Kilmarnock, the community wants to own a community centre. I've got no pressures on me from the community to take control of the remediation of gasworks, to put sustainable urban drainage infrastructure in, to put pipes under the ground to stop flooding. That's seen as our job and we're getting on with that. But the assets that are created on the back of that, there's no reason why they can't be taken forward through some form of community ownership. But that's a wider policy issue and it's not for me to specify that.
Mr Manson, I think the response you've given there goes to the heart of the issue about what we mean by regeneration of an area. You talked about major infrastructure works being carried out by the URC. Should that work not be being carried out by the local authorities, Scottish Water and other agencies rather than URC? And could the money that's going into the URC, because I'm looking at some of the figures here and I'm looking at the level of public funding that's going into the URC, like the Edinburgh Schools situation, it sounds as though the money that's been going into URCs has been subsidising what should have been spent by other agencies to ensure the redevelopment of areas took place. And as what we've actually seen is a transfer of resources into what should have been a situation or facilities and services provided by another agency, a local authority, Scottish Water or whoever.
Mr. Manson? If you go back to the starting point of why create a URC, it was to make things happen where things weren't happening, to get the targets and outcomes that you want that weren't being achieved otherwise. So you have two approaches to that. One is to persuade every agency, every organisation and every private sector funder to change their approach, to change their priorities and invest in what should happen in that area. Your other alternative is to create a dedicated body that will try and achieve that by one way or other. There's no doubt that it's a mixed picture. There are some schemes where we have had to put the money on the table in order to lever in other public sector money. There are other cases where we have been able to make the case to other public sector agencies and they've come in and put the investment in on their own. If it was as easy as simply saying to these agencies, come in and do what's right in this area, then you wouldn't need a dedicated body on the ground. So I think we have to face up to the fact that we're dealing with public sector agencies that have other priorities, private sector companies that won't come in and invest, and how do you dig into that spiral of decline, which in areas like mine have been going on for between 40 and 50 years. So yes, there will be some cases where you might say, well, that organisation got help with that asset and they should have put their money in. I've certainly felt that many a time. But on the other hand, you have to get things going and you have to make an area that wasn't a priority for an organisation, get it higher up on their list. And the best way of doing that is to put some finance on the table and match fund and make sure that you get the result you're looking for. And that's what Clyde Gateway has done.
The Convener, that brings me on to the question I wanted to ask about the match funding issue. And I thank all the URCs for the information they've provided for today's evidence session. But when I start looking at some of the figures in terms of the level of investment that's taking place so far, then I see very little private sector investment. And where I do see private sector investment or anticipated private sector investment, it's in house building, or predominantly in house building, as my overview of it is in relation to the investment in the area. Now, I'm assuming that the major objective of all the URCs is to create sustainable employment. Private house building, in my experience, doesn't necessarily provide sustainable employment. What it does is provide relative short-term employment opportunities for local individuals. How do we guarantee that the leverage for all the public money that's going into the URCs ensures that we have sustainable employment opportunities for the local residents in the areas that are supposed to be impacted by the URCs? And I'll ask Mr Wiggins first.
Thank you. I think, again, there's several ways to maybe approach this. First of all, our two major housing schemes, as it might be badged, are in fact mixed development schemes. So we're very clear that what we're not trying to do is create a new housing estate. We're trying to create mixed development, which has a mixture of employment opportunities as well as housing opportunities, changing the housing market, yes, but also looking at how we can tie into leisure opportunities, such as the marina, for example, in Ardrossan, but also to create more business space on the back of the enhanced environment that we're looking at. So our schemes are not just housing. We're aware that we need to look at a wider canvas than that. Secondly, I think you need to look at the span of things that we're doing. Some things are very costly because it's about infrastructure and it's repairing some of the damage which has happened in the industrial past, for example. But also it's about creating a vibrant place. So you have, yes, a varied and effective housing market which offers a range of choice, but you have attractive town centres where people want to come and live and spend their money, and you have the business infrastructure in place to make it somewhere where people can work, somewhere which is attractive, somewhere where people want to come and invest their money. So a lot of what we're trying to do is put in place an environment or a landscape which is attractive to investment. So you need to look at these things, I think, in the round and the different types of interventions that we're making. And what we're trying to do is attack those different elements. A good place to live, a good place to visit, a good place to spend your leisure time, a good place to invest and create your business. And what we're trying to do is create that entire package.
Mr Robertson.
If I could maybe start by one of the initial prompts as to why my organisation came into existence. Several large employers from the Clydebank Business Park had left the area, so there's very much a focus on a need for economic infrastructure, which is what our particular priorities have been, where we've put in office space, particularly focusing in small office space, likewise small workshops, the type of development that investors and developers wouldn't necessarily be picking up because they're not necessarily financially attractive. So from our very earliest days, we've had a successful workshop development that's been creating successful employment for local residents as well as people coming into the area, and likewise with their offices. But I think, as Patrick's already mentioned, there is an element of our sophisticated economy where, in many ways, if you're talking about regeneration, it needs to be multi-stranded, taking account of considerations such as housing, because somewhere like Clydebank may be a comparatively cheaper option for people to reside than certain parts of Glasgow. So there are wider economic benefits, people paying council tax, people shopping locally, in addition to just locally provided jobs. Likewise, one of our strategic objectives is to be better connected. We are a small town on the edge of the city region. So in many ways, again, it comes back to without us becoming solely a dormitory function, of course there needs to be inherent on-site economic activity. But if we are better connected, we can get people in and out of the city, which again reinforces the economy. So I think it's one that getting jobs, sustainable jobs, jobs that are available to local people is absolutely a priority. But I would suggest that it's one of many priorities for successful, sustainable, long-term regeneration.
Mr. Manson.
Thank you very much. We have an example of a house building industry that is sustainable. Much of the kit now is made off-site, and in our area we have 50 Clyde Gateway residents working in a housing manufacturing plant, which is a green job because these are the way you get your highest environmental standards. A warm and comfortable job compared with being on a site, and as long as the company does well, a long-term sustainable job. So we actually have an example that would probably challenge a little bit the house building example that you gave. We are engaged in sustainable employment opportunities. Some of the companies have moved in are working in the oil and gas industry, for example, and we have 6 local people working in Glacier Energy's factory in our area, making widgets and exporting them abroad to the oil and gas companies. So manufacturing is on its way back into the East End of Glasgow. And on the leverage issue, I would quite simply say that the history of the last 50 years tells you that the private sector will not invest in sites which are contaminated, which have been vacant for 50 years, which have in sometimes health-threatening contamination in them. And without the public sector pump priming that, getting rid of the contamination, you won't get the private sector leverage. I'm pleased to report that where we have succeeded in private sector leverage is on the first sites that we have decontaminated and made ready for development. So whilst the figure spread over our 20 years and over our whole estate is not yet up to scratch, if you look at it on a site-by-site basis, then it shows that the model of pump priming to attract private investment is working.
As I said, I'm looking at some of the figures. Take, for instance, Irvine Bay Regeneration Company. In the opening paragraph and performance summary, there's a quote here that says, this in turn has secured an additional 37.3 million in private and other public funds towards key projects. Then you turn over a couple of pages and you find out the direct private sector leverage is just over 7.4 million. The rest is public sector funding. In those types of figures, where is the private sector funding coming from? If I'm looking at this, and if I go down to Clydebank Rebuild, and then we get a figure of 65.4 million being cited as investment, indirect public funding, and then you try and look at the indirect private sector funding, you get 11 million. The figures in terms of leverage don't seem to be matching the level of public funding, and I take on board the issue about cleaning up contaminated land. Formerly, what the health boards and other organisations used to do is just build hospitals and houses on the contaminated land before they cleaned it up. The type of responsibility that's been put on the URCs and the public sector to clean up this land, to make it once again usable, clearly indicates to me that a lot of public money, not only just through the URC, but also other public agencies, are heavily investing in these communities, and I don't see the return from the private sector at the present moment. And will we be guaranteed a return from the private sector in terms of the levels of investment we expect to get? Mr. Manson.
Very brief answers now, please, gentlemen.
Nothing in life is guaranteed. What you look at is what's in front of you, and on the sites that we have remediated, where we've been able to attract developers and companies, then the leverage is very, very high indeed on these specific sites. The private funding is coming from institutional sources, Aviva, the BT Pension Fund and other sources. So this is entirely possible. But the background to your question is, where is any sort of private money going into any sort of property development over the last few years? So the achievements in the East End of Glasgow are against the tide They're in a case where market failure has gone as far even as city centres. So what you have is in front of you is a hard-won achievement in very, very difficult circumstances. And the judgment is for the committee to take. Does this start mean that over the 20 years the £1.5 billion of private investment will come in, or will it not come in? My judgment is the land is available, the infrastructure has been put in, we're dealing with an area in the heart of Scotland's biggest conurbation, we've got a community that we must help in terms of future jobs and employment. So yes, it will happen.
Briefly, Mr Robertson.
I think I mentioned earlier that in all of our areas we're dealing with very difficult sites, so there is a requirement for front loading, which of course will mean that there's a very high profile of public spending. And it's back to my comment about getting us to the start line, that we are increasingly getting to the point that we have sites that the private sector, be it developers, be it investors, will now consider they're at the start line. So we recognise that private investment is a competitive game. However, we now have sites that 10, 15, 20 years ago wouldn't have been capable for development, for business, to create people locally or from other parts of the world for housing and so on. So it is very much a case of we're there and we now have wares to sell, which wasn't the case prior to our interventions.
Mr Wiggins.
I think some of the points is a long-term process, and pump priming investment has to go in at the start of the process, and we believe and we're optimistic that the returns will come. We're already beginning to see an uplift in terms of the level of inquiries that we're getting, particularly on the back of the enterprise area. So if we can convert some of those into investment and jobs, then yes, that investment will arrive and that will come. But it's a long-term process. We're dealing with deep-seated generational problems in areas where the decline has been going on for decades, and we're trying to turn it around. We're putting in place the infrastructure, we're preparing the sites, we're preparing the land, we're getting in place some of the business opportunities, and we believe we're putting our communities in the best possible position to take advantage of any economic upturn.
Mr Adair.
In the last 3 or 4 years, there has been very little private sector investment, even in the centre of Edinburgh, which is quite clearly not in the regeneration area, and yet there has been no, in fact just one, commercial office block built on spec in central Edinburgh. So to expect that there would have been private sector investment in the regeneration area like Craigmillar would have been unreasonable. Yet we are now at the point where we are now reasonably able to expect that there will be private sector investment in retail developments in Craigmillar. So I believe that as the economy in general improves, the investment that has been put into the Craigmillar area will, over a number of years, significantly longer than we originally envisaged, but it will attract a significant level of private sector investment for the good of a sustainable community.
Yep, thank you. Cameron Buchanan, please.
Thank you. This is really a question for Mr Manson, Robertson and Mr Wiggins. Thank you very much, Convener. I note from your submission that the emphasis on attracting private investment as your business plan. What are you doing to keep the initial private sector jobs you're managing to attract and that will last? Because it's my experience that often these private sector jobs come and then go. So are you doing anything to sustain them and hold them there?
Mr Manson?
Yeah. Well, the private sector jobs that have come are good ones. They're in oil and gas, they're in construction. My judgment is that these are key sectors which will continue to grow, and I think that's Scotland's judgment as well. The best thing we can do to help and sustain companies is if they grow, that we can provide the business support and the land and premises available for these companies to grow in the area. The history of the East End has been successful companies looking to expand and not being able to find an uncontaminated site or a suitable building and moving out. And you know, Barzion Brew is a classic example of that. So what we're doing for the first time is making sure there's land and sites available for companies who want to expand and remain in the area. But there is business support available and various other sources. We don't supply that because we don't duplicate what's already available that's successful in the public sector.
Thank you.
With the tenants that we have in our industrial and office properties, as a matter of course, when they first come in and on an ongoing basis, we make sure that they aware of the services from our partner agencies, be that the Business Gateway Service, the Economic Development Team at West and Bartonshire Council, and particularly for fast-growing companies, there may be support available from Scottish Enterprise with regards to account management. So it is very much a case of we speak to them initially when they come in, but it's a case of reinforcing that there may be a range of business support mechanisms, including support with taking local people on.
Mr. Wiggins.
Again, a lot of the investment that we've received so far has been from good quality local companies who have a long-standing relationship in the area and have an ongoing relationship with the communities and indeed the people that they employ. So we're confident that they'll be there for the duration. We also work very closely with North Ayrshire Council and Scottish Enterprise in terms of ensuring that there's the aftercare and the business support mechanisms in place to support businesses. I think the other thing I'd say is that if you look at the enterprise area and the way that the financial incentives are structured for that, it's very heavily geared towards the end user. By that I mean, for example, the capital allowances which are available in the enterprise area are for plant and machinery. They're not for buildings, they're for plant and machinery. So the idea behind that is that people invest very heavily in plant and machinery. Actually, you're much less likely to move away and find a cheaper place to produce whatever it is you're doing, because you've made that very significant investment in plant and machinery in situ, and that's much harder to shift and should be longer term and more sustainable.
Mr. Buchanan. Stuart McMillan, please, then.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Just a couple of questions. On page, well, first of all, actually, before I do, just on the joint submission on page 4, regarding at Riverside Inverclyde, it talks about an MSP being an ambassador for the Ocean Youth Trust. Just for the record, I am that particular MSP. In terms of a couple of questions, on that submission, on page 8, it talks about the common targets that the URCs would like to see actually considered. Can any of you provide the committee with any information in terms of what common targets you would actually like to see in place?
Who wants to go first, gentlemen? Mr. Adair.
Comment came from the other URCs, so I wasn't involved in writing that comment. I'm not quite sure what my colleagues were seeking to mean by it.
Okay, Mr. Wiggins.
Yeah, so I have to refresh myself on that. I mean, I think we do have common targets in as much as we all look at leverage, we all look at jobs, we all look at jobs, space regenerated and so on. So, I mean, there is some commonality in terms of the types of KPIs that we all have. I don't think in that document we were suggesting there should be anything over and above that, but actually we're all measured in pretty much the same way. We all respond back through the monitoring and evaluation framework, which is provided by the Scottish Government every year, and it's all tied back to the Scottish Government's core objectives and core strategies for economy, health and well-being and so on. So all of the things that we do actually feed back in through that monitoring and evaluation framework.
Just a very small part of that paragraph, it does say we would also welcome the introduction of a small number of common targets for URCs.
I think if you look at, we actually report on 34 different indicators through a monitoring and evaluation report. It probably is the case that a smaller subset of that might be something which might be more useful for people to interpret in relation to URCs. So, for example, in our submission, we've pulled out the 4 or 5 key indicators rather than the full 34, which actually tends to confuse things a bit. So there's a number of key indicators which I think we all would accept are appropriate to be measured against.
34 for you all that you measure against? Or
well, there's 34 we report on. There's actually more within the monitoring and evaluation framework, but we don't hit all the targets. So if you look at all the different targets which are in the monitoring and evaluation framework, they cover a whole range of different activities. We don't cover all of them, but we actually report on 34 for the ones that are relevant to us.
Now. Mr. Stevenson, very briefly.
I just wanted to be quite clear. KPIs are not targets and targets are not KPIs, are they?
No, they're not the same. I mean, the performance indicators indicate how you're progressing towards your target. Yeah.
Fine. It's just the way it was presented sounded otherwise.
Yeah, okay.
Mr. Robertson. Back to Mr McMillan's original point.
I think, to be honest, Patrick's covered the answer that I would make to that.
Mr Manson, same.
I would welcome common definitions. Even GVA, which was mentioned earlier, has a number of different ways of being calculated. So leverage, amount of land remediated, I think we need to be much clearer if we're going to make comparisons across Scotland as to what the common definitions are. I would welcome targets being set collectively for public sector agencies in terms of some of the key things we are trying to achieve. If you look at what's happened in London with convergence targets, where the intention is that the East End of London meets some of the average figures across London on education, ill health, etc., then I think that's a potential way forward for Scotland. But clearly, a URC on its own couldn't achieve these, but the full might of the public sector working with the private sector could, and I think that would be a noble aim for us.
Mr McMillan.
Also on that joint submission paper, there's a phrase that's littered throughout it, and we've also heard some comments from it today as well regarding dealing with the effects of decades of major deprivation and disadvantage. So we've heard some variations of that comment today. So with that being the case, also with the URCs being established, have the expectations that have been placed upon the URCs been too great?
Hours on that particular topic, gentlemen, but very brief answers, please. Mr Adair.
I think the expectations were demanding. I would say that they were not too great.
Mr Wiggins.
I think to address those problems, it's not just the URC has to, or is resourced to address those. We have to work in partnership, and that's why we in particular feel the community planning partnership is absolutely critical, so that all the public agencies working in the area are all focused on key deliverables to address those long-seated or deep-seated problems of deprivation. But it's not just us on our own.
Has that been the case for every single URC?
I can't speak for others, but I know that all the URCs routinely work in partnership with their local partners. What form that takes, they'll be able to answer themselves.
Mr Robertson.
I think in the current environment, there's no two ways about it. We are the standard bearers for regeneration of our area. Undoubtedly, there does need to be very close connections with partner agencies, and I think there's also a subtlety. It's important that we have ambitions. It's important that we're demanding of ourselves and our partners, but there are external factors that kick in, such as economic downturn. So there's a subtlety in how organisations such as ourselves are reviewed on an ongoing basis to take account of factors that we may not always have direct control about or over. But I think the reality is that we're thrusting and we're demanding in terms of getting a job done which has been left for many decades and needs to be completed.
Clyde Gateway is first and foremost a partnership. So the targets are ones that we will lead on and make sure are addressed, but they can't be achieved without major investment from Scottish Water, the support of the two councils, the utilities, SEPA in terms of flood prevention, decontamination. This is a partnership, and I spend about a third of my time on things that could be roughly called maintaining and sustaining this partnership. Within that partnership, you have a body that has a board, some resources, some assets that can go on and get some of the jobs done itself. And I think we've got the right mixture there.
Very briefly, Mr.
Okay, thank you. Mr Manson earlier spoke about the remediation costs. I think it would be useful to hear from each of the panels in terms of how much investment each URC has actually put in to actually deal with the remediation costs, to actually then take you to a position of encouraging other investment.
Very, very brief answers, gentlemen. Mr Manson, do you want to start off?
Yes, every URC is different and has to face a different set of issues. The defining issue in the East End of Glasgow and in Shawfield in South Lanarkshire is the ground conditions. So the bulk of our public funding has gone in to bringing sites up to a state under which they can be developed. So you're talking circa 70 or 80 million pounds going under the ground to fix the problems of the past, without which nothing would have happened.
I think if we could get the specifics of that written to the clerks, that would be useful. Mr Robertson.
I'm unable to give you a specific figure, but what I would say is that our primary site, Queen's Quay, that when it comes to the decontamination, site preparation, major civil engineering, that was of the order of £8.5 million out of a total redevelopment cost of 16 million. And that very often is reflected across the other locations we've been in.
Again, if we could get the detail to the clerks, Mr. Wiggins.
Our decontamination costs are less. We've avoided some of the worst contaminated areas in our patch, for example. So they tend to be less, they tend to be quite light contamination costs. So a lot of our expenditure has gone in terms of site assembly and indeed infrastructure going in to open up those sites.
Mr. Adair, I don't think this really applies to you to any huge degree, does it?
No, it doesn't. For example, we've only spent probably 5.6 million on site infrastructure, though that does not include costs incurred by Edinburgh Council in site clearances.
Okay, if we could get the detail to the clerks, that would be very useful. Finally, you talked about the fact that you talk to one another. Do you benchmark against one another? Do you see yourselves as allies or rivals, shall we say, in terms of what you're doing? In very brief answers. Mr. Manson?
Comparisons are useful between the URCs because of the history of the areas, but they are very different, so detailed benchmarking doesn't take place. I benchmarked against the urban development companies and corporations in England, but most of these have now been abolished one way or another. However, in the east of London, there is significant onward investment going on, and I compare ourselves very closely with that. I have to say, the level of investment going into the east of London is astonishing. And even post-games alone, £500 million has been invested in continuing the legacy forward. So I benchmark against that, and I aspire to that.
Yeah, I can understand that, but at the end of the day, you've got near neighbours that you could be benchmarking against, surely. Mr. Robertson?
I think when it comes to benchmarking, as has already been mentioned, that our local circumstances are such that it may be difficult to undertake direct comparisons. When it comes to your question about friends or rivals, I think it's fair to say that we are all part of the urban regeneration movement. So without speaking on behalf of colleagues, I would suggest friends.
Mr. Wiggins?
Yeah, definitely allies, not rivals. And I think there's a lot we learn from each other. Quite often it's in terms of ways of delivering. I think there are very, very significant differences to the URCs in terms of population, geography, types of land issues, depths of market failure, but we can learn from the practices of each other, and that's what we do by regular contact between officers from the different organisations.
Mr. Adair?
I agree with the previous comments, particularly Patrick's.
Okay, thank you very much for your time today, gentlemen. I'll now suspend for a few minutes for a change of witnesses. Okay, folks. We now move on to our second panel. I'd like to welcome Alan McQuaid, Business Infrastructure Director of Scottish Enterprise, and Douglas Duff, Member of the Scottish Local Authorities Economic Development Group and Head of Economic Development and Environmental Services at Falkirk Council. Can I start by asking you, gentlemen, if you have any brief opening statements?
Not from me.
Mr Duff?
Perhaps, if you don't mind, I would give just a brief statement to explain a bit about Slade and the purpose of my being along today, particularly to say that Slade is a representative body for local authority economic development officers. That's where the acronym comes from, but importantly it brings together economic development officers across the country whose aim is to help develop the economic development services that we all offer through our councils. We do that in addition to our day jobs, so we all have an active involvement in economic development and regeneration across the country, and we try to muster support to develop that jointly through the activities of Slade. We have a number of subgroups through the work of Slade, which includes a subgroup on regeneration, but we also do work on business support, on employability and tourism, etc., to try and galvanise the activity that's taken place. Slade has been through some considerable changes in recent years, particularly as a consequence of the decision to transfer responsibilities for Business Gateway and Regeneration to councils, and we've given particular focus to how we develop the organisation, bringing forward work with COSLA and Improvement Service on an improvement guide for the development of economic development services and the development of an outcomes framework which is being shared across the country and will give a common means of reporting on our activities. So Slade very much starting to galvanise its activities. I think it's been recognised and welcomed by the different partners that we work with, most recently in the development of a local Economic Development Partnership Forum that is jointly chaired by the Enterprise Minister and by the portfolio holder at COSLA. So we do see that being a valuable way forward to help to integrate the local and national agendas that we deal with. Maybe just personally also to say, in terms of my own responsibilities, I'm involved quite heavily with Slade, but I also have a day job, which relates to my position with Falkirk Council. Responsibilities that relate to economic development and environmental services, and we do have a strong track record in the fields of regeneration, most recently in bringing forward quite a significant tax increment financing initiative, TIF, which some of you may be familiar with, but does involve quite a substantial commitment by the council in investing in the area and hoping to attract quite significant investment from the private sector. And that's an important and flagship initiative, we believe, for not just Falkirk, but for the country as a whole. We've also been carrying forward work in our town centres. So we have been working through and to develop a Falkirk town centre and 4 district level centres, and we've also been delivering the project known as the Helix, which is a national living landmark project, one of 3 across the UK, and we believe is a signal of the transformation that is possible in an area such as ours. So quite a lot going on there, but certainly very, very keen and actively interested in regeneration.
Thank you, Mr Duff, and I'll start by asking you a few questions round about economic development activity. Obviously, members of the committee at various points have visited various places. Some councils choose to invest quite heavily in economic development activity, some quite a lot less. Could you maybe give us an indication from your national experience of how much of that economic activity that is taking place in the 32 local authorities is looking at regeneration and, in particular, community regeneration?
Slade has done work recently to estimate the total commitment of its activities by councils in economic development. That works out about 213 million annually, and certainly is recognised as a significant contribution. I don't have the details on the breakdown on an apportionment across the various fields of activity. That's something that I could certainly ask for, but it does cover our activities in respect of physical regeneration, employability and business support.
I think it would be useful for us to get that information. Obviously, we all have a certain amount of experience in our own area about the economic development activity that goes on. I think that can be extremely wide and varied, and I just think it would be grand to get an indication of how much of that effort is being put into regeneration. Mr McQuaid, if I could maybe turn to you from a Scottish enterprise perspective, how much of your expenditure as an organisation is spent on regeneration activity, and maybe a little bit beyond that, you can give us an idea of what proportion of that would be spent on community and social regeneration?
Yes, Convener. As you'll know, our primary focus is on to increase Scotland's economic prosperity. We moved away from local regeneration in 2008 with the change from the enterprise companies, and we moved away also in 2012 from funding the urban regeneration companies as well. So our primary focus is on economic growth. That's not to say we have abandoned regeneration. We're still involved in regeneration activity through our work, as you know, with the urban regeneration companies, through a number of other initiatives that we're involved in, the national ones of Clyde Waterfront and Dundee Waterfront, and through other initiatives such as in North Ayrshire working on Hunterston, which will bring economic activity. Ravenscraig and Gartcosh we're still involved in Western Bartonshire. We're involved with Strathleven Regeneration Company, and in Aberdeen City and Shire in Energetica.
Because you're saying that you've moved away from regeneration to a degree, and you are concentrating on economic growth, and yet you've listed a number of regeneration projects which Scottish Enterprise are involved in.
Involved with some of them.
So you have not really stepped away from regeneration.
We have, in the main, where it's local regeneration, we have absolutely stepped away from that in terms of what the councils are responsible for. There are a number of initiatives where there are legacy issues that we're still working through with them. For example, I've quoted Ravenscraig and Gartcosh. And we're involved in regeneration where we bring expertise from a national perspective, such as the closure of Diageo in Kilmarnock. I'm on the East Kilbride Task Force, which is to do with the change of Rolls-Royce from East Kilbride to elsewhere in the city. So we're involved, but not directly involved. Our investment is limited. I don't have a figure that I can give you. It's not substantial, apart from where we've got a commitment to Dundee Waterfront, and I can provide the figures to the committee for that. Where we are involved in supporting regeneration is our work with companies and in our sector growth activity, where Scottish Enterprise is very focused. Our work with companies, do get assistance through Regional Selective Assistance for Scottish Enterprise. The Regional Selective Assistance map is drawn in a way that it's for areas of most need. So through our support to companies, we do indirectly help the regeneration of areas of need. And in some of our major sector initiatives, we are developing in areas that are adjacent to areas of need. To give you an example, in BioQuarter in Edinburgh, which is a life sciences project, but that's adjacent to areas of need in Edinburgh. A renewables infrastructure plan, which is following the government's offshore wind agenda, supports development in Ayrshire, and in creative industries along the Clyde Pacific Quays being developed, which is next to Govan in Glasgow. So we do, through our activities, help with regeneration by providing growing employment which can be taken up by people within these areas.
I find it interesting the way that you've put it, saying that you've moved away from regeneration, but at the same time you're listing all of these projects which are either adjacent to or in regeneration areas. And obviously you've said that there are monetary commitments to regeneration projects like the Dundee waterfront. I think maybe it would be a good idea if you could send us some detail on the framework that you work to in this regard.
What I would say then, by way of clarity, is in terms of our primary focus is growing, creating economic growth, and in terms of budgets, it's a small proportion of Scottish Enterprise's overall budget that is allocated to these areas. But we do work, many of these projects are partnership projects where we bring our expertise, as I've said, in terms of assisting with the development of them.
But the aim in certain areas to grow the economy is through regeneration projects, like Dundee waterfront.
That's one, yes, but that, yeah.
I think we probably require further clarification. It would be good to get an indication of how much money is being spent in some of these projects in regeneration areas.
Happy to provide that.
Stuart Stevenson, please.
This is specifically for Scottish Enterprise, although perhaps Mr Duff may wish to say something. I have a constituency that crosses the boundary between HIE and Scottish Enterprise. HIE specifically has in its remit a social aspect, and in the long run we can see the effects of HIE's efforts in generation perhaps rather than regeneration, because there was nothing there to start with. Do you think HIE has some advantages in this area because of its different remit?
Sir McQuaid.
I think that's an interesting question. I have, before I joined Scottish Enterprise, I worked in HIE. So there are different challenges in what what it's charged to unlock is the community remit. I think it's unfair for me to comment on that because Scottish Enterprise has a remit and we're working to that, as does HIE. There are many challenges in rural areas of Scotland that you could look at and say, well, they are similar. But commenting beyond that, I think it's beyond what I think is reasonable to speculate on.
Let me just develop the rural issue, because Aberdeenshire, of the mainland council areas, is the council area with the greatest proportion of its population living in a rural area, greater by 2% than Highland is the case. So within Scottish Enterprises remit, there are substantial rural areas, and elsewhere in Scotland, for that matter, in the south in particular. So I just wonder if that is outside the brief of Scottish Enterprise, but in HIE's area, it's inside the brief of HIE. In the partnerships that you have and the relationships you have with others, do you see that part of HIE's remit being discharged by others? Because I understand you're working to your remit, and that's fair comment. But do you see that part of the remit, which is fundamental, I think, in what the committee is trying to look at in regeneration, being picked up by others? Or do you see things that we should consider as a committee, perhaps in saying to others as output from our deliberations?
I can only, I don't have experience of enough experience of the rural area to be able to comment on that. What I would say is Scottish Enterprise does have strategies for our rural areas which supports the economic growth of the rural areas, where it's not our remit, as we're discussing, is to become involved in the community's remit that HIE have. What I would say is that in HIE there are areas where obviously the overlap can be grey in terms of what's community and what's economic development. Scottish Enterprise, clear economic development remit. Does it fit with our priorities? Is the scale relevant in terms of the level of investment for a rural area?
Forgive me, and let me just have one final shot at this. Yeah. You're perhaps uniquely in a position where you as an individual might be able to help the committee because you have been in HIE and Scottish Enterprise. And I'm really just trying to see, based on your personal experience, as distinct from your current role, which I understand the distinction, whether you see that other bodies that Scottish Enterprise work with are picking up that responsibility which in HIE is inside that enterprise agency. Because I think if your experience tells us that there are limitations and difficulties there, then I think this committee should, go away and do other things to think. I don't
see limitations, but I would qualify that by saying most of my focus is in the urban areas of Scotland. So day to day, I don't see that.
That's good enough. Thank you.
Okay. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, panel. You were still in morning. It's for Mr McQuaid. What do you believe your role you play in the community planning partnership process, or the community planning process?
Fully engaged partner. We're involved in all of the community planning partnerships through senior officers in Scottish Enterprise being the representatives to each of the organisations. Also, we have, as part of that responsibility, we have a senior officer within Scottish Enterprise as a location director, parallel role to what government has with each of the local authorities. So we're fully engaged. An observation would be that community planning partnerships, like all partnerships, work differently, and our engagement with some is different to others, but absolutely fully committed to community planning partnership.
Going on to another, it's for...
Can I maybe come in there, Anne, before you go on to your other question? You say that your engagement with some is different from others. Does that mean that some of the engagement is good and some of the engagement, shall we say, not so good? And where does the difficulty lie? Does it lie with the community planning partnership, or individual community planning partnerships, or is it maybe the case that you don't have the right personnel engaging with the community planning partnership?
I'll give you my own experience. I've got responsibility for 3 local authorities, and it depends on the focus of the community planning partnership and whether, how they engage and what the priorities are in a specific area.
How they engage, surely you as a member of a community planning partnership have some say in the direction of that community planning partnership.
We do.
And you've said that your focus is on economic growth. I would imagine that most community planning partnerships have similar goals in their single outcome agreement.
Yes.
So maybe expand on where the difficulties lie?
I'm not highlighting difficulties. What I'm flagging is that relationships across partnerships can be different, and in some they're better than others.
For what reasons? What makes a good relationship compared to a bad relationship?
Again, you're referring to good and bad. I'm not. What I'm saying is that some relationships can be stronger. It's possibly through...
So what makes a strong relationship compared to a weaker
Well,
relationship?
it depends on your... you have a strong relationship where... potentially a stronger relationship where you've worked with a colleague over a number of years compared to becoming involved in a partnership more recently, and it takes time to build relationships.
Okay, I think we may come back to that. Anne, sorry.
Yeah, and it's just another question to Mr Duff. Not the same question, sorry. Throughout our time going around the communities with the committee, community groups have often said to us about trying to access resources and the difficulty of that, them being overly bureaucratic and only being available for a certain amount of time. Do you consider this view and how would you go about rectifying it?
Sir Duff.
It's certainly, it's been very challenging circumstances. I think that, clearly there has been quite significant pressure on budgets right across the board, and there has been pressure in areas that have been focused on community support. I think a lot of that, you know, comes down to demonstrating the evidence of the benefits of community engagement. And I think, you know, through certainly seeing some of the work of the committee, you have been able to see good examples, and good examples of where community projects have put together proposals that can clearly justify their call on resources. Where I think it's important, it comes back to the point about community planning partnerships, is to see that community engagement is a fundamental part of their role, and to resource that properly. And I think you will have seen in the evidence that you have that some partnerships have put quite significant resource behind that and have helped communities to access that resource. In other areas, I think it's a bit more patchy. And, you know, that's perhaps something that has to be addressed. Certainly, you know, I think that where community bodies are properly resourced, people are clear about their purpose and about the benefits that can come through that process, I think that can really solidify and enhance the approach to regeneration.
I think the key to that is, or the message about that is about trying to keep it simple.
I would say certainly. I mean, this whole field has been through quite significant change, and I think is going through even further change as some of the budget prospects come to fruition. You know, we are currently anticipating further reduction in budgets in councils in the next 3-5 year period, and every pound is going to be a prisoner. Now, you know, clearly, I think within that, it's going to be important that community engagement in the range of activities that we are undertaking is clear and viewed as a priority, but is clear and simple as to how it takes place and how it plays its part in the range of other pressures that we face.
Thank you. Thanks, Kabina.
I wonder if you could maybe give us an idea of how many of your members are involved in community planning partnerships in the 32 areas at the higher level, board or maybe just below.
Economic development, as we're saying, it's a priority for every council's community plan. You'll see it, you know, embedded in all community plans and all SOAs. That's clear and understood. When it comes to involvement in the various partnerships, I think that comes down to the priority that that is afforded within the range of other pressures that community planning partnerships have to deal with. In some council areas, you know, where the economy is relatively sound and robust, it perhaps isn't a priority, and therefore the resource input is lesser. I would say that in the vast majority, economic development certainly is you know, viewed as a priority, and economic development officers are pretty regular attenders at these meetings and are expected to account for the actions that they have in their SOAs and are committing to in the community plan. So we are, you know, strong participants in the community planning process. I would say that, you know, some do play an active role in helping to shape and maintain the community planning process. It's a fundamental plank of that work. And
so give us an indication of where you're at in Falkirk, for example.
Yeah.
Are you on the board of the Community Planning Partnership in Falkirk?
I'm not on the board of that. There is a leadership group, and I attend that leadership group. I would say perhaps half of its meetings over the course of the year I would attend, or someone covering our economic remit would attend. So we have an economic strategy, My Futures in Falkirk, and regular reports are sought on the work that we're doing in relation to that. Particularly in, you know, our community planning partnership is a very strong focus on employability. The need to help young people into the labour market has been seen as a priority. And, you know, that is certainly something that is very frequently discussed and aired with the council reporting, but also other partners reporting and how they support that work.
Okay, and in terms of your engagement with communities as part of the community planning partnership, where do you fit in there?
Yeah, engagement with communities tends to come through particular activities that we have underway. So whether that's through our work in town centres, I mentioned the Helix project earlier on, has come through a very active community engagement process. So it tends to be, you know, horses for courses. In economic development terms, community engagement is only one aspect of what we're doing. There's a range of other responsibilities there. We also connect into the wider community engagement process that the Community Plan Partnership sustains. So they have an ongoing relationship, and community representatives are involved in that partnership. So our economic work and community engagement tends to be more issue specific, be it town centres, be it employability, these things.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just to follow on from that in terms of the town centre involvement, I know there's a lot of work being done in Falkirk Town Centre, Grangemouth and Denny Town Centre, particularly Denny Town Centre. I know the area as well. That's the business community you're engaging with in the main. How do you engage with communities? And the definition of communities that we're trying to, I think, as a committee get to, are the people who are living in communities that are either deprived or low-income communities, and getting them engaged in the economic development issues and discussions and decisions. How do you do that in Falkirk?
In Falkirk, we've got a range of tools that are used in our community engagement activities, and particularly in town centres. It's not just about business. We do engage very actively with business. We have a business panel that involves any business in Falkirk has an entitlement to be part of that panel.
My question was specifically about engaging with communities.
Yep.
Not business communities, because I know the work that's taking place with the business community in Falkirk Council. I'm trying to get to the issue about how do we engage with the residents around the town centres and within the communities who at the present moment are struggling economically, and to get them involved in the decision-making process. For instance, in this issue, in your case, Falkirk Council, because you talk about engagement officers that go, are the engagement officers linked to your economic development unit, or are they linked to another council department? And how do you then cross those links over when you're trying to engage with, say, the communities that live around Denny Town Centre, who are concerned about the issues in Denny Town Centre?
We have an officer who has a responsibility and engagement with the community. They are actively involved in working with communities in each of those town centres. They have, in the past, and what we've done is conduct community surveys. We've held regular events. At the point in time where there's a scheme to bring forward, where there's a proposal being put to the community, we would arrange events and involve people in shaping those proposals. We encourage input to proposals through individual groups, whether that be schools. We have very active involvement with local primary and secondary schools in the plans as they develop. We work with specific, we work with each of the community councils, so we keep regular contact with them about proposals that are coming forward. Our officers are out and attending at community councils on a regular basis, or feed in notes to give an update on what's happening. And we can engage with specific interest groups, whether that be a group of individual retailers or older people, young people, bringing forward particular projects. We've had examples recently in Falkirk Town Centre where we've been bringing forward a Townscape Heritage Initiative. It's one of the largest Townscape Heritage Initiatives that have been approved in Scotland, and that has been built in very active community involvement through the heritage bodies, through the local historical society and the churches and the schools. So that's got very strong and active engagement of the community. It's brought forward the first project in the churchyard in the very centre of the town centre, and is being showcased as an example of best practice in how to involve the community in shaping that design. We build into these projects also community benefits. So we have a community benefits and procurement policy that is applied to any capital investment that's been undertaken. So these are built into the delivery of the projects that we have underway. So we do have very robust arrangements for community engagement and in the development of our projects. It's warts and all. There are circumstances where people are unhappy, unsettled about the proposals that we have to put to them, but we have to acknowledge the wider concerns of the community and try and realise those.
Mr Duff, I welcome your enthusiasm for the community engagement that you have in Falkirk. Would you say that community engagement is replicated throughout the other 31 local authorities in Scotland? And are all economic development units as high profile within the local authorities as you have indicated in Falkirk?
I think, there's a diversity of approach that's adopted. I think the tools are all there in the box for regeneration. The tools are all there for community engagement, for delivery of physical projects, for delivery of employability. I mentioned community benefits. People know how to do that now. So these tools are all there. Our officers are equipped and do utilise these, and there's many examples right across the country of economic development officers being engaged and bringing forward these projects, whether that's in the cities, in towns or out in the rural areas. So there are many examples, and I can't say that Falkirk is any better than any authority across the country in doing it. I think what we do recognise is that these tools are there. The resources are pretty stretched in order to utilise these tools, and that's about the judgment that officers have to make as to what's appropriate to use in what circumstances. And ultimately, it comes through our political processes as to how those resources are secured.
Mr Duff, what would you say to the communities that we've been engaged in as a committee with the housing associations, community organisations, who want to get actively involved in economic development issues, who feel they have been ignored, they've been bypassed, and have had decisions foisted upon them without any consultation? What would be the Slade attitude to that, those issues that have been raised with us as committee members, that local communities feel they have not been actively involved in? And you're quite right, the toolbox is there. It's how you use the toolbox. And are you confident that every member of Slade is using the toolbox in the same way or in the same appropriate manner?
I think we recognise that we've got a way to go here. The task of regeneration, was transferred to councils and in terms of a specific focus that had to be brought together. We used to work very closely in partnership with Scottish Enterprise at local level and how these things are brought forward. Now councils are charged with taking forward that agenda. In Slade, we've developed an improvement guide with improvement service, so that maps out the range of services that we're expected to deliver, and we are urging councils across the country to be utilising that. But I can't tell officers to suck eggs. Many of them do know and are practising this already. When it comes to community engagement in regeneration, as I've mentioned, there's good practice right across the country, and it's about spreading, communicating awareness of the practice that is there and the good results that come from it. I think, as you've seen through the work of the committee, that has been, there has been very positive examples there, and that certainly is something that I think should be getting communicated more widely. Economic development officers, though, are under considerable pressures, particularly in this past few years where we've been experiencing the recession. So they do have to be focused in where they can put resources into community engagement as against all of the other activities they're expected to deliver. There are other people out there that they work with, whether that be community education services, local community capacity building organisations, CVSs and others. And I would say, you know, I have an experience. I used to work in South Lanarkshire previously, where we did put a lot of effort into making sure that there was proper resources for community organisations, but also make sure it was simplified. You know, it was more streamlined, more effective in making it clear what the community could contribute and could gain back from the process.
Thanks, Convener.
In terms of that questioning that Mr Wilson has just gone on, you've talked about engagement and all the rest of it, and we hear a lot about this. But in terms of some of the answers that we get, we don't hear about the influence that the community has in shaping and developing small and major projects. So in terms of Falkirk, what influence does the community have in shaping some of the larger projects that you've talked about and some of the smaller ones which often make a huge amount of life difference to people?
I would say, you know, and it comes back to my point earlier about tools in the box. You know, I think that...
The box, what influence do people have?
Yeah, well, I was going to suggest that first up, if you're talking about initiating a project in an area, then you would want to address how the community there might be engaged in that and in shaping it.
Could you give us an example?
So if it's town centres, then you would want to be starting the conversation with people who've got a stake in that town centre. We've been doing this recently in Falkirk. We've had open events with retailers from the area and with anybody else who has a stake. That could be community interests. The historical bodies were there in force. The local business improvement district and town centre management interests. So there's a range of stakeholders can come together there.
You've talked a lot about the stakeholders, but to paraphrase what you said, and anyone else who may have a community involvement. Now, I can understand folks from business improvement districts having a great say and influence in what's happening in Falkirk. I would imagine if the business organisations are well organised there, which I'm sure they are, that they will have a great influence in what happens. But then there are the other community interests. Now, one of the things which I have found, and I'm sure others are the same, is that often things go ahead and folks who are living in town and city centres and those who use those towns and city centres on a regular basis feel that they have had no influence. And I'm still getting from you that although there is influence brought to bear in terms of a number of other bodies, the community interests are one side.
Well, I would have to say, you know, and I apologise if I'm giving that impression, because I would say that they are very, you know, openly seen as an active participant in that. So when events like that are held, and we had one recently in Falkirk, we had perhaps around 150 people in the room, and many of those were just people walking in off the street who have got a, you know, concern about their town centre. They expressed those comments were all captured. They were asked at the end of that meeting, any volunteers to come forward and consider how these issues should be addressed. And that is being taken forward by a small group of those volunteers. It includes people from the community, it includes retailers, it includes people from the business improvement district. And so there's, at present, it's early days, but there's no formal structure around that. In time there could be, and that would give a basis of capturing all the concerns and trying to demonstrate how they can be fed in.
Can I stop you there as well? Because you've just said that a group of volunteers are involved in driving this forward, who put themselves forward, which is self-selecting. I think one of the other things that we have found, which there is some difficulty with a number of community organisations out there, is when these self-selecting groups suddenly are the voice of the community.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, we also recognise that can be a concern. So I think importantly, and in addition to doing that kind of exercise, you also have to conduct broader surveys. You have to conduct consultations with specific interest groups. So this is not about a single means to identifying a way to engage with people. There can be a raft of different means of involving the community, and it's how the compendium of those views come together to shape the eventual result. We've had good examples. We've completed a townscape heritage project in Bowness, and it was conducted very much on that type of approach. So we have got examples where we are able to show it can work.
I think maybe you could help us a little bit by writing to us about these examples and showing us where there has been community influence in terms of the delivery of these projects. Mr Wilson, sorry.
Thank you, Convener. It was just to follow up on that. If Mr Duff has been asked to provide us with further information, I'd be grateful, Mr Duff, if you could give us, out of the 150 people that turned up to the consultation event, because the retailers and the Business Improvement District members, I would assume, are the same people, because the retailers are the Business Improvement District members, and they're the ones who financially contribute to the Business Improvement District. And I know I've spoken to a couple of retailers in Falkirk about the Business Improvement District issues. But if you could give us an indication of, out of those 150 members, how many of them were genuinely community people who walked in off the street and did not have a vested interest as either a retailer or, as you've described them separately, as a Business Improvement District member. And out of the volunteers, how many of those volunteers are what I would term ordinary punters who are concerned about the shopping facilities within the town centre?
If that could be done as well, that'd be grand. Anne, you want to come back in?
It's just wee quick questions, and hopefully if I see them fast, we'll get through them. The funding that you provided to the 6 URCs to date, can you tell me how much that has been?
Roughly, it's just 4 in terms of the 3 that were here today, excluding Craigmillar and Inverclyde. So it's the West URCs. We're not involved in Raploch or Craigmillar in terms of funding.
I apologise for that. How much for the 4?
I would need to give you the information back.
That would be helpful.
It will be in the submissions from the organisations.
And how you evaluated the effectiveness and the impact of that spend, will that be written somewhere? Are you able to tell us now?
We're not in a position to do that at the minute, because as we know from the last session, we're pardon me, we're going through the exercise with Riverside and Inverclyde. I can provide or obtain for you what the internal evaluations are from each of the URCs and what they've done. They're in different stages of their process. And as we've talked about, or has been talked about earlier, it's a long-term process, and therefore the outcomes, you have to give it, some considerable time.
Obviously, there's their internal evaluations, and we've gone over some ground there, and we'll probably go over more ground there in a wee while. But as you, as an organisation, as Scottish Enterprise, are pumping money in, you must be evaluating what is happening with the money that you are putting in right across the piece. And if you're not, then are you truly following the public pound?
We are, and we do, in terms of evaluation. What we did have since 2008 was a ring-fence budget for the URCs in terms of other priorities that the money could have been spent on. Now, that's not to say, then it was just given over, but it was set against priorities and worked in partnership with government around what we expected from the outcomes, because government is a partner in part funder of the URCs as well.
So you must be evaluating all the way through, right? So you said initially that you couldn't give Anne an answer to her question.
We evaluate their business plans of what their proposals are, but the detail of what their plans are in line with what their business plan is, absolutely. whether they're achieving the outcomes, what I've said is those are long term, and we're going through the process with Inverclyde.
We understand that a lot of these outcomes are not going to happen like that, and that a lot of them are going to happen over the piece. I think the committee gets that completely and utterly. However, you must be, as each and every one of these projects progresses, as you are putting money in, you must be evaluating what is happening on the ground at that point in time. And you must have an idea of what is likely to happen in the near future. Would that not be the case?
Well, yes. I mean, what we do is, as I've said, is we assess against their business plan what their proposals are, and as they draw down, as they drew down money, because they don't draw down money from us anymore, they draw down money against their plan, then we absolutely review what they are doing with, or what they did with the money. It's not the case of, we do follow the public pound to ensure that it's spent on what it was allocated for.
I understand that too, what it was allocated for, but obviously, from my perspective, you should also be looking at not only what it was allocated for, but what the outcome of the spending of that pound actually did.
Yes, but that's part of the business planning process for the organisation, was that they evaluated through their board and through with representatives from Scottish Enterprise, the publics and the councils, with the government in attendance usually, around what their plan was, what their business plan is, and then there's an agreed allocation from the organisations against which the money is drawn down. The outcomes and checking the outcomes are an ongoing process, as colleagues from the URCs have talked about earlier.
So, at any point when you were putting money in, did you stop putting money in to certain areas of work in certain URCs because you did not feel that there was value for money in what was being done?
No, we did not stop putting money in because there was ring-fenced budget. The value...
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr McQuaid. You know, I've dealt with ring-fenced budgets previously as a councillor, right? But just because a budget is ring-fenced...
I'll answer, if I may interrupt you, if I answer it a different way. There was never a case where we felt that there was an allocation of money that was inappropriate in terms of what the outcomes would be.
Okay. Anne, do you want to come back?
Yeah. It's a different question, but still on finance, and it's about regeneration activity. What proportion do you currently spend on regeneration activity, and what proportion of that supports either the community or the social regeneration?
I've said earlier I provide information on the amount of money we spend, and I could go into a comment about indirect supporting of money. Our monies that go into regeneration activity are for physical, and it would be very limited in terms of as an agency, we're a business development agency, so it would be very limited in terms of the money flowing through to community. It's not our remit.
Yeah, thank you.
Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. Just a couple of questions. First one is just regarding the urban area and the urban's enterprise zone status. Earlier on, Mr McQuaid, you spoke about the legacy issues, sector growth help, and the RSA, and with that also going into areas of most need, and particularly the major sectoral initiatives. So with those kind of 3 points, how are SE working with the likes of Irvine Bay and the I3 urban enterprise area to ensure that they can actually maximise what they actually need to do?
It's the same process with all of the URCs in that our position with them is if they have sector development projects which fit with our business plan and our priorities, they would, and there's a case for investment, we would make a case, take a case forward for Scottish Enterprise to invest and support. Irvine obviously has the additional status of the enterprise zone status. As yet, a project hasn't come forward from Irvine for within the parameters of a development that meets that criteria. What enterprise zones are, a government tool, came from central government as well. But what that does, or we would argue, is we would be looking to see, hopefully, that enterprise zone status would be used as a tool that would reduce other public sector support going into the project. What we have done, by way of example, is Irvine Bay URC have a GSK, and there's a life science potential in the area there. We've worked with them to support, albeit in a small scale, the development of the refurbishment, in fact, of a property that will help support a company going into a company grow in that area, life science company. So that falls within our sector growth. Irvine Bay also have Scottish Enterprise own a large site in Irvine, which is the potential as a data centre. We're working in partnership with the URC to ensure that that's promoted as an opportunity for economic development in the area. It's standard across the area. I'll give you another example in Inverclyde, potential for the cruise liner terminal to expand within our tourism sector development. We've said to the URC, working in partnership with Clydeport, if there's a case to be made for public sector investment there, then subject to other priorities and availability of budget, that's the sort of thing that Scottish Enterprise would support or look to support because it's sector growth.
I'll go back to the Irvine Bay just for a moment, if I may. Just in terms of I would assume, therefore, that certainly discussions regularly take place between Irvine Bay and yourselves. You mentioned this site, this large site that SE own. Are there any particular blockages there to promote that particular area?
Demand is, the market is the way it is. So obviously, we have a remit to promote Scotland, and therefore, we will give every area an opportunity, but the demand is limited, particularly in terms of the data centre market at the minute. I don't see any blockages in terms of if you're thinking of relationships or anything like that. No, we work closely together.
Okay. No. In your submission, on page 1 of your submission, to answer to question 1, and it's paragraph 2, starting off from clear priorities. It then goes on to say in the second sentence, they also send a strong message to the private sector about where public investment is most likely to enhance the conditions for the private sector, making the returns on investment sufficiently attractive. When I first read that, my thinking kind of took me to a kind of place of suggesting that the place where you get a better return will actually be somewhere like one of the cities, as compared to maybe a URC area or somewhere that's maybe a town that's a wee bit further away from a city. So, is my thinking correct, or am I incorrect in that? Is there more of an emphasis placed upon the cities as compared to areas where outside of the cities actually they've got a tremendous amount to actually offer?
No, there's Scottish Enterprise, a national agency. We will promote opportunities to all areas. I think, in terms of, it's been a while since that was obviously submitted, but one of the important things in any opportunity is the strength of public sector partnership and giving the confidence to the private sector that things are joined up. I'll give you an example again. I know I was at a board meeting of Strathleven Regeneration Company, and I understand you personally going out to see them. And that's a great example of the public sector working together to give the private sector the confidence. It's a great example also of, and it caught the market at absolutely the right time, and I acknowledge wouldn't have been done now, of limited public money levering tens of millions of private money. So it's about, as I say, if the public sector demonstrate they're joined up, and it's in simple things like planning, building control, and all of these things to give the private sector potential investors a confidence, that makes a great deal of difference. And in the main, I see that across Scotland, because the economic development departments of the council and the councils now realise that's the way you have to do business.
Sure, thank you. Does SE and Slade have any comment regarding the impact of the current procurement processes and rules upon the successful delivery of the economic, the physical, and the regeneration activities, and also in how do you fully utilise EU funding to really promote and help what you want to do?
Procurement processes are, in this day and age, long, but the way to achieve it is to anticipate them, to live with them, and to work with them. So there is no criticism of the process. It's the public pound that is being spent, therefore it's appropriate to do that. In terms of European money, then we would look to maximise what is available. There does come a point in terms of available European money that below which there's a cost benefit in terms of staff resources and input that's required to achieve what can at times be quite a small outcome. But that would only be on a rare occasion. I don't know if that's what you're asking.
I would concur with what Alan's saying. You know, clearly procurement practice has become, you know, very intensive, and also, as he's saying, for the right reasons. You know, these are public resources that we're expending, so we have to do it properly. It's also about equipping the businesses within Scotland to make the most of the opportunities that are there, and certainly through our work in the economic development networks, we support the supplier development programme, which helps to train and equip companies to access the projects and expenditure that we are procuring. We want to make sure that that is promoted across the whole of the public sector, and there are very active discussions taking place with government about promoting that, so we are able to ensure that business is taking advantage of the resource that we are able to commit. I think also we've got good practice now in terms of building in the kind of regeneration benefits that can come with that expenditure. I mentioned the community benefits in procurement, so that's about building in requirements for training to be provided as part of the work, or encouraging the growth of the local supply chain. So, you know, there is good practice out there. We all live with it day in, day out, but we are looking to take it clearest advantage we can towards benefit and regeneration.
Cameron Buchanan, please.
You talk about a joined-up, coordinated approach to development earlier on, and adjusting the market. I just wondered, and you mentioned things like retail units. Scotland is full of retail units that have not been taken up, either being built by developers or nothing depresses an area more than seeing retail units, new ones particularly, that have never been taken. How do you adjust the market in this way, not just with retail units, but when things are obviously not working? How do you adjust the market?
Clearly, you know, I don't have all the answers there. There's been a national review of town centres recently that has given some recommendations. These are, you know, very serious questions that are being put right across the country and are affecting every town centre at the present time. Yeah. I think the clear expectation from that is that town centres need to be given more priority, more recognition, more prominence when it comes to using tools like business rates to try and encourage investment into town centres. Certainly from the perspective of local authorities, that has been a priority, long-standing. It's built into the planning process. It comes through that so that we are encouraging the investment to take place in town centres. We try and muster other support from across councils and other partners. So that can be about encouraging new housing investment to take place, or utilising roads or other utility spend in town centres to upgrade them, and trying to attract external funds. I mentioned the Townscape Heritage is a good example. So really you have to look at the strengths of a town centre, and for some town centres that can be challenging, but you need to get in about and understand what it is possible to achieve.
But I wanted to focus on adjusting the market. If something isn't working, how do you change it?
Yeah, well, I think some of that has come through the National Review. It is suggesting that we need to prioritise town centres and restrict out-of-town development, and that I think is now recognised as being an important recommendation of that review. Planning, the local plans and so on have been recommending that kind of approach for many years, but this would be about consolidating that. It is very much about working with and trying to use the market to generate as much investment and focus it where we can. And I think there are many examples up and down the country where it is about working closely with developers, where they can attract funds from elsewhere. If councils do have assets, then they can use those. They can apply them together into the pot to help to attract that investment. But these are very challenging issues, and particularly in the experience that town centres have had in the past 5 years, it's certainly something that's very much in our face.
Are you taking these into account then, this adjusting of the market?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been seen up and down the country just now, and the approaches that we are now talking about in town centres is about being much more focused about what can be achieved. And I think there will be circumstances where we are saying that the extent of commercial core that town centres used to have is going to have to shrink. And other uses like housing, like other civic amenities and so on, are going to have to come in to replace that. Councils are using their assets. They want to use their assets to try and attract investment. But I think it is about having a coordinated approach.
Okay. Can I thank you very much for your evidence today, gentlemen, and I suspend the meeting for a few minutes for a change of witnesses.
Thank you. We now move on to our final panel of witnesses. I'd like to welcome Margaret Burgess, MSP, Minister for Housing and Welfare, and David Cowan, Head of Regeneration Unit at the Scottish Government. Minister, would you like to make an opening statement, please?
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'd like to start by emphasising the Scottish Government's commitment to ensuring equality of opportunity and support for the places and people that need it. And I recognise that the need remains great, particularly in a recession and the emerging issues caused by the UK Government's welfare reforms. But we have ambitious regeneration vision as we want all of our communities to be socially, economically and physically sustainable. And there is a lot of good work that's been done across Scotland, but to deliver our vision will require a long-term and sustained commitment from all partners, local authorities, third sector, private sector and active community groups. We've been working to put in place the right conditions to implement our vision and to focus our funding where it can make the most difference. The Spruce Loan funding to leverage private sector investment into regeneration projects, the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund, which will support regeneration projects with strong social outcomes and promote community participation, the Vacant and Derelict Land Fund to bring land which can blight communities back into positive use, and funding to support and promote community-led regeneration. And our primary fund to support community-led regeneration is the People and Communities Fund. And it's been so successful that it has been significantly oversubscribed. And I therefore asked officials to have a look for other ways to increase the fund. And I'm pleased to announce today that we have devised an innovative way of generating additional funding for Scotland's most disadvantaged communities. Charitable bonds will be used to increase the People and Communities Fund and support projects that will benefit more of our disadvantaged communities. And at the same time, I'm really pleased that our investment will also be helping to deliver much needed affordable housing in Scotland. And it's the first major investment in charitable bonds in Scotland. And I think that shows clear evidence of how this government is taking the initiative. But there's also a number of Scottish Government funds available to community groups for a diverse range of activities. We've now published an updated list of Scottish Government funds available to community groups on our website, and this should make it easier for community groups and organisations to apply for and access Scottish Government funds. But however, I believe that regeneration budgets can't be seen in isolation from other policy areas. The nature and scale of regeneration interventions will vary, involving different layers of government and partners depending on the local circumstances. But I firmly believe it's the local element that's the most important in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, and welcome your announcement about the charitable bond, and I'm sure that members will look at that in some depth later on. You talked in your opening statement there about the levering in of private money. One of the things which we have found where there has been some success is small community groups, community-led, Seat and Bacchies, for example, in my own constituency, with small seed corn sums of money, pooling in lots and lots of money from elsewhere. And I think one of the things which has heartened the committee as we have been going around the country is the passion that a number of people have, not only for their own communities, but for ensuring that the neighbourhoods that they live in and those that surround them do better than they are. In terms of the Scottish Government's definition of regeneration, there's a major emphasis on place. And I wonder if maybe we should be looking at changing that emphasis and putting people further up the agenda. I wonder if you would comment on that.
I think in terms of, I absolutely fundamentally agree that people are at the heart of regeneration, but I actually believe people are at the heart of everything we do in government, and everything we do across government is about people. It's about improving the lives of people, it's about improving communities, and it's also about improving businesses to allow Scotland to flourish. And that's the heart across the whole of the Scottish Government. So in regeneration, as I said earlier, it doesn't sit in isolation. People are at the heart of our regeneration. We're putting quite an emphasis now on community-led regeneration, and by community-led regeneration is not about public sector involving the communities in some small way. It's about encouraging people to take an active role in their community, to look at the opportunities in their community, look at the issues in their community and take that forward. And that in some areas will require some support, I accept that, but it is about that active participation. So it's a holistic approach we have in the Scottish Government, but I certainly want to make it clear that it is about people. And if somewhere in our definition somewhere that I haven't seen, because we've talked about a holistic definition of regeneration, if it's in some way looks at that we don't have people placed as high up that, then I'll certainly look at that again. But absolutely, as I think I said it the last time I came to the committee, for me it is about as much about people as it is about buildings or anything else.
Thank you, Minister. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Convener. The Minister may be aware we've just been hearing from the Business Infrastructure Director of Scottish Enterprise, and I realise the Minister is not responsible for the enterprise networks, so we'll say that at the outset. But I just wondered if she felt that with Highlands and Islands Enterprise having as part of its remit a social obligation, but Scottish Enterprise not having it, that led to the enterprise network not being as fully engaged in much of Scotland in this agenda as perhaps HIE have been over the long run in the north of Scotland. And I put that in the context of my constituency crossing the boundary of the two enterprise bodies, and therefore I'm perhaps uniquely in a position to compare and contrast.
I'm aware of the situation in Highlands and Islands and how they engage with social enterprises. However, as you rightly said, the enterprise set-up, the way it's set up, is not within my remit. And I think in some ways that sector-led, the way it is just now, I think we will see benefits to what perhaps the way it was in the past. We have to move on. But certainly, I think we have to have in every area support in some way for the social enterprises and community enterprises. Now, whether that be through the enterprise, Scottish Enterprise or Highland Enterprise in your area, or whether it's some other way of doing it, I think it's absolutely right that we have to support social enterprises. And I think the convener said at the start about how small businesses, small groups can bring in, lever in amounts of money that make a huge difference in their community. And that's the kind of thing, you know, we're looking at, and looking at capacity building within communities, looking at supporting communities to be able to build the capacity to be able to organise and function, you know, eventually stand on their own 2 feet with certain organisations. So
is the Minister saying to the committee that the future is very much where the power is as close as possible to those who are going to be affected by the decisions? In other words, that if we engage local communities and local bodies, the stake is higher for these people, the outcomes are likely to be better, the quality of the decision making will be better because they understand the problem better.
I think that's absolutely what we mean by community-led regeneration. It is about communities identifying their own the issues in their area and being involved. And I think all the evidence shows that where a community has been involved at the outset, then the outcomes are better for that community. And I've also seen the kind of enthusiasm that the convener was talking about. I spent the whole recess visiting various communities, community groups that have been funded by the People Communities Fund, some that have been funded through other resources, and the real impact that they're making in their community. And I think it does produce sustainability. But not every community is at that level and have to be supported to get there.
Thank you, Richard Baker, please. Thank you, Convener. We heard in the earlier session about potential for procurement to play a role in encouraging regeneration through current use of community benefit clauses. But of course, your Cabinet Secretary, the Deputy First Minister, is I know going to be bringing forward a new sustainable procurement bill. Will that be a focus in that bill about how new procurement legislation strategy can also be used to support regeneration initiatives?
because I think we're looking at community benefit, and I think that's been looked at and been looked at closely in terms of the procurement bill, that there should be some community benefit. It's part of regeneration. It's back to what I said initially, that regeneration is not about just one strand of Scottish Government policy. It crosses all the policy areas, and therefore it's about the collective and the collaborative way that we can regenerate communities, which includes what we can do through procurement, what we can do through housing, what we can do through health inequalities. All of that is part of regeneration.
You've mentioned housing, and rightly that there's not just one strand to this, but obviously housing is a very important strand. And we looked at, for example, the figures from Irvine Bay. We had a target for 1,200 new homes, of which 8's been built. Now, is your view, in retrospect, the Scottish Government could have done more to allow those targets for housing to be closer to being achieved, or was it simply that some of those projects were too reliant on housing? Or why do you think there's been that specific problem, as it were, for many of these projects in terms of housing initiatives?
I think in a number of ways, and I'll maybe ask David to come in here in case I'm off here in terms of the project you talked about in Irvine. I think that was a project that they hoped to attract private finance into, and the market failure didn't allow that to happen. But there's lots of other things going on in regeneration and housing, with our housing associations, with the Scottish Government funding for affordable housing. So housing is part of regeneration, but David, am I right in the Irvine one?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. It was one of the ones that Irvine Bay were hoping to attract private investment for, which has yet to happen, obviously. So, but I don't think, as the Minister says, it's across the piece. Housing is going quite well.
Although there have been other schemes that had similar problems, but what you're saying is it's an issue of market failure in the private sector rather than, from your point of view, support from the Scottish Government.
Yes, in terms of housing, and in terms of, I think housing, the Scottish Government is on a target for our affordable housing programme, and we will meet that target, and we're quite confident we'll meet the target of our affordable housing.
Thank you. Okay, Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Minister. So also 2 weeks ago, we had representatives in front of us from Riverside, Inverclyde. And it was quite a lengthy session, as you'll be aware. But one of the things that certainly came up for me was in terms of obviously what was actually going on there, and I'm keen to try to understand what role the Scottish Government actually had in terms of keeping an eye on activities within RI, and could the Scottish Government have undertaken, or could they have done anything else? Could they have done any more in terms of scrutinising what was actually taking place?
I think I would say a couple of things, that URCs are not part of Scottish Government, although they receive Scottish Government finance. The URCs are partnerships with local authorities, Scottish Enterprise, and themselves, so they're private companies. They're funded by us, but the Scottish Government, in terms of funding URCs, looks at their business plan annually. The business plan is looked at, it's discussed with them if the business plan is going to meet what we think is feasible, and the funding is paid quarterly in arrears to the URCs. And every URC are asked to revise their business plan if we feel it's too ambitious, it's not feasible, or something's gone wrong. So the business plans are revised as we go along and look at them. And URCs were asked to revise their business plans, as was Riverside Inverclyde. And as yet we haven't agreed, I'm hoping correct saying we haven't agreed the revised business plan as yet. So I think what the Scottish Government has done to date is as much as we could do, given the relationship we have with the URCs, that we haven't agreed a revised business plan with them yet. I understand that Riverside Inverclyde have now set up, they've got a temporary board, and they're looking at the proposals that were in the revised plan that we're suggesting and working with them, and then that will come back to us before they receive any further funding.
When did this request to RI take place? For them to change, well, for them to revise their plans?
The then Cabinet Secretary Alex Neil wrote to both Inverclyde Council and the Riverside Inverclyde URC beginning of 2012 about spending plans and what the Scottish Government's allocation was likely to be. So when he wrote to Riverside and Clyde, indicating he would give them funding in 2014-15 or 13-14, sorry, and then 14-15, he said that was predicated on seeing revised business plans, so the URC submitting revised business plans to Scottish Government and their board, and also submitting plans for the future of the URC in light of the funding circumstances.
So I would assume, therefore, that as a consequence of that particular correspondence, that discussions between Scottish Government officials and potentially the Cabinet Secretary, I don't know, as well as officials from RI and Inverclyde Council will have been taking place on a fairly regular basis regarding that particular matter?
Yes, I went to a board meeting where that was discussed as well, and I've met the then Chief Executive Bill Nicol fairly frequently to discuss progress on revised plans. It's fair to say there wasn't a lot of progress made about what the future of the URC might look like, but that was also, in my view, in speaking to the Council and to Scottish Enterprise, was the reason for undertaking a mid-term review, was to look at what the future options might be for the model for the URC going forward.
But the mid-term review, I mean, that was already agreed at the outset of RI, once the management structure was to be agreed, if I'm correct in saying that.
In the articles, it provided for a mid-term review to take place.
Yes.
The timing of that hadn't been pre-decided. It was decided in light of, if you like, the financial circumstance and the funding elements, that it would be a good time to do that review.
It hadn't been decided. You're saying it actually hadn't been decided in terms of the timescale for when the mid-term review was going to take place?
Not specific to the specific date. There was a broad expectation it would take place roughly halfway through the lifetime of the URC.
Right, okay. Because there seems to be some confusion in terms of actually when this was to take place. I'm sure I've read somewhere that it was to happen once the management structure was signed off, and that was 18 months after RI was created. So it was to then take place 5 years after this management structure was signed off. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's broadly correct, but a specific date of the review wasn't decided. So so that review then took place also not just in light of what would have been agreed in the articles, so it was in the articles, but also in light of the situation, the economic situation and the funding, the settlement that had been agreed.
Right, okay, well, thank you. Just a question regarding the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund. Obviously, kind of going forward, that URCs have to, there's a bidding process now as compared to the continual kind of funds that were already allocated to them. Is this, in terms of this bidding process, will that actually be a more efficient process, and are you expecting a better outturns as a consequence, or could this be seen to be creating a bureaucracy or some bureaucratic measures within the URCs for them to put together bids to try to get some money for projects?
The bidding process for the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund is not exclusively for URCs. URCs can bid too, or special purpose vehicles can bid, as can local authorities. The funding arrangement for that was agreed with COSLA of the 25 million a year. The bidding, well, less the core amount for URCs that hasn't been agreed how much to each as yet. But that's the agreement with COSLA, and that took some time to come to that arrangement. And we have had bids in already. It's an independent panel that are looking at the bids for this. There's certain criteria, one of them being community participation, one of them being social outcomes and community participation. So any bid and quality will be looked at on that basis. So I do think it's a fair process. It's one that the first, I think 41 have been moved through to stage 2 of the grants, and they'll be looked at, and eventually out of that, I wouldn't want to say a figure of how many will be successful, but the criteria is quality, community participation and social outcomes.
In terms of the community participation, obviously some of the URCs have community reps on their boards. Would it be fair to suggest that if there are more community reps on the boards of the URCs, then they might actually have a better, they might stand a better chance of being successful in a bid. Would that be correct?
Well, I couldn't comment on that. The bids are, it's an independent group that are looking at the bids, and I'm certainly not going to say that that would be a criteria. The criteria, as I've said, quality, how they've participated in the bid, is using the community in participation and taking forward the project, and also social outcomes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Good afternoon, Minister. You mentioned earlier, Minister, that obviously your view of regeneration expands over several areas. How do you monitor that, and how do we evaluate that?
Well, I think in terms of how we monitor housing in terms of how we meet our targets in terms of house building. So I mean, government monitors, each section of government monitors the areas that they're responsible for, but it's looking at that all together. In terms of, I mean, which specific monitoring, I mean, I'm just not clear on what you're asking.
I'm just thinking about the specific part of community participation throughout all of it. And I'm aware also, in a separate question, that a few of the bills that are coming are being introduced. It's just about how you, as a minister, is going to ensure that regeneration is going to be at the heart of some of these bills.
Think about the bills that you're talking about.
The bills, the procurement reform bill, the EU funding, community empowerment and renewal bill, and Scotland Cities bill, and the national planning framework and Scottish planning.
I mean, when I talk about community-led regeneration in terms of the, I didn't necessarily say that, you know, if we're having a housing development, it would be led and started from the community. It would be about involving the community in the siting of it, in areas of it, community would be involved in it. But in terms of how we would measure, I mean, I think the Empowerment and Renewable Bill says for itself, it is about community. It's about engaging communities, working with communities, and that's out for consultation. So I don't want, or it's going out to consultation, so I don't want to preempt anything that may come up in the consultation. The Procurement Bill is looking about community benefit, if we can get as many community benefits out of that as possible. European funding is about social deprivation now, that's the focus, but it's split on the certain areas, and is about social deprivation, which that is about people, communities getting involved, making applications for that. The other one, sorry, Anne, the
Scotland Cities,
the city strategy, again, part of the city strategy, it doesn't sit in isolation. It's about benefiting the city. It's about community being involved in it. It's looking at the wider city. It's not just the city itself. It's about what's happening around the peripheries of the city, and ensuring that there are social outcomes. In all of the strategies, we're looking for social outcomes.
Thank you. Can I just have another wee question? Yeah. I know this topic's dear to the Minister's heart. It's about community associations and the role of community associations. Should these bodies have a statutory role to play within the community planning process?
Community associations. I mean, some community associations.
Sorry, that was my fault.
Housing associations. First thing I would say is I think that in every community planning partnership, if it's appropriate, they should involve their housing associations, if they're local housing associations. I think we'd all agree the role that housing associations, community housing associations and cooperatives play in their local community. And I think I would say that absolutely at the outset. But in terms of the statutory role, I think we've got to remember that every single housing association is a separate entity. They are diverse organisations. Some have charitable status, some have not. They've all got their own strategy and planning. And I mean, I would be more interested in the outcome of the consultation when the Community Empowerment Bill was looking at community planning partnerships within that bill, if that comes through. So I think my instinct at the moment would be to say I don't think it should be a statutory thing, because we'd be forcing housing associations and charities to be involved in something that they may not feel a need for within their strategy. But I'd be more concerned if a member was telling me here that any housing association had been excluded that wants to fully participate in community planning partnerships, if they'd been excluded. And if that was the case, that would cause me concern. I think if they want to be involved, they should be involved, and there is a role for them, and it's appropriate, and I believe it's appropriate.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Minister. Just to follow up on the questions from Anne McTaggart, we have heard, certainly I've heard as a committee member, the issue from housing associations that they're not involved as actively as they should be in the community planning process. And in particular, they feel that they're being bypassed when it comes to decisions regarding housing developments in some areas. Now, I'm not saying this is across Scotland, but in some areas they've actually been bypassed, and they feel they are not being consulted by the community planning partnerships, or indeed some of the local authorities and economic development agencies that are working in particular areas. What assurances could we give housing associations that they should be fully consulted, particularly when it comes to housing developments, because they are a major player now in delivering social housing, and can I get some assurance that they should, further to the answer you gave Anne McTaggart, should be fully consulted as an equal partner within the housing development process where they have a direct interest in the community?
I mean, I would certainly say, repeat what I said to Anne McTaggart, that I do think there is a role to play for housing associations. But in terms of the local housing strategies, when local authority, because the local authority being the strategic provider for housing, they have to consult housing associations and demonstrate they have done so when they're submitting their plan to the Scottish Government. Now, if that's not happening, and I haven't heard from any housing association that they are not consulted, or any housing association organisation or development housing association that they've not been consulted, so if that is not happening, then obviously I would want to know about that and would look at that, and that may be when we would, because certainly, you know, that's separate from community planning partnerships, but local authorities in terms of their local housing strategy must consult with housing providers in the area. That is absolutely laid down.
I welcome the Minister's response, and hopefully the housing associations I've been speaking to, or have been speaking to me, will look at the report of this meeting and the official record and respond accordingly if they feel they have been excluded. To follow up on the housing association issue, Minister, some of the same housing associations have expressed concern that the housing regulator is curtailing some of the wider role activities of housing associations, and feel that they're getting a less than positive response from the housing regulator and the issues that they could be involved in driving the economic regeneration and social regeneration of certain communities. They feel that they get, as I said, a less than positive response from the regulator as to those activities. Could you, as particularly as Housing Minister, shed some light on whether or not housing associations could be, should be and will be involved in future economics and social regeneration within communities where they see it as being appropriate?
I mean, the first thing I'd say about the regulator is that the regulator is an independent body and not answerable to government, but is answerable to Parliament and not to government. I believe that housing associations do have a wider role, and where it's appropriate, they should. The regulator is solely to look at tenants and those that get services from social landlords, and how that's managed, and looking at the financing of the housing association. But I believe, and I've seen it, and I still see it as I travel around housing associations, what they can contribute in terms of the wider role. Now, I'm not aware of this being curtailed in any way, but what I'm saying from my point of view, that housing associations do have a role to play. The People and Communities Fund, I think that the bulk of the projects that were successful have been projects that are either by local development trusts or in partnership with housing associations. And I've visited numerous projects by housing associations showing a real community spirit, evidence of real improvements in community, talk to beneficiaries of the projects that have been managed by housing associations or a subsidiary of a housing association. So yes, I mean, and I would hope that we can continue to see that, but I cannot speak for the regulator.
Minister, for that response. Minister, I should have said at the start of my contribution, I welcome the announcement you made in your opening comments about the charitable bonds and the new revamped website, as I understand it, in terms of the funding register for community organisations. I think one of the points that was made earlier is that for community organisations to apply for the funding, sometimes they have to go through another local authority or another agency to assist them in that funding process. And sometimes, and I'll take an example in my own area and declare an interest in this one, is the Vacant and Derelict Land Fund, where a local community group has attempted to apply for funding through that. But because the funding is made via the local authority, they find it very difficult to get the local authority to support them in their application. Can I seek assurances from the Minister that some of these funding, some of the funding that's available from Scottish Government for communities could be made easier or should be made easier for local community groups to apply for, and where they are facing barriers from, say, for instance, local authorities, that the Minister will look carefully at that to find out whether or not there are ways we can actually bypass the local authority in relation to those applications.
Well, when I spoke earlier about the funding available for community groups on the website, that is purely Scottish Government funding that is accessible directly to community groups. Not the vacant and derelict land funding is a separate funding thing. It's an agreement with COSLA how that funding is distributed. It's recently just, I think, been agreed for this year. It carries on as it previously was, and we're looking at how that funding will be distributed in future years. But that's an ongoing discussion that we have to have, or no, it's not me that has it, but that has to be had with COSLA about that particular fund. But I just want to emphasise the funds that I was referring to. There are other Scottish Government funds that are available to third sector organisations that are paid directly to umbrella funds who distribute it in their own funding arrangements. I was talking specifically to Scottish Government funds that's directly accessible to local community organisations.
Convener, just a final question. Minister, we've been looking today at the whole issue of regeneration and how communities are engaged in that process. We heard evidence earlier and we read evidence from URCs about the amount of public money which has been ploughed into regeneration projects in particular areas in Scotland. In previous visits to communities, the committee has heard from community organisations which have indicated that for every £1 of public money received, there's a £14 return within those communities. Could I get some assurances or some indication from the Minister that the Scottish Government will look very carefully at future regeneration programmes to ensure that communities are, and I'm talking about local people living in areas where we have identified that there are issues of deprivation, low incomes, poor employment levels, that the Scottish Government will look very carefully at trying to ensure that resources are ploughed in to assist what we now term anchor organisations within those communities to try and maximise the benefit of the public pound going into these areas to ensure that we are getting a better return for the investment that's taking place.
Well, that's part of the rationale behind the People and Communities Fund about anchor organisations and ensuring the money is used in the community to benefit the community. I also think in terms of the review of community planning partnerships, in terms of the single outcomes, where they have to look at ensuring that the community is properly participating in what's happening, that there are outcomes for disadvantage, inequality, that those are the priorities that have to be tackled. So any of the funding that we're doing will be looking at those aspects of it, and certainly it's about reducing inequality, tackling disadvantage within communities, and encouraging and assisting and promoting communities to be involved in it and lead in it where they can and take things forward.
Hey, if I can maybe follow on from that, because your regeneration outcomes frameworks have clearly got a link to single outcome agreements and also the local government benchmarking work that we have been carrying out investigation into of late as well. Do you think that with that linkage and what you've just talked about, will you be able to monitor as a government much more the regeneration outcomes that we all hope will improve, and will you be able to ensure that the community input is actually there and that communities, like Mr Wilson says, are listened to?
Well, I would certainly hope under the revamped single outcome agreements that we could do that, because at the end of the day, community planning partnerships are accountable to their community, and it's the results for their community, and looking in terms of child poverty, monitoring child poverty, monitoring what's happening to older people, monitoring, you know, the disadvantage improvements. So that's the expectation there is with the single outcome agreement. And also, I think there's an opportunity here in the community empowerment and renewable, keep saying renewable, that to look at how community planning partnerships can be upscaled, whether or not there should be statutory obligations put on them. So that will be out for consultation, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing what the result of that consultation is and how it goes forward on that basis. But I do think we want to be able to monitor the outcomes, is what you're saying. I'm hopeful that we can do it better now.
Thank you. A lot of the evidence that we have heard from some bodies has been about hard regeneration, if you like, buildings in the main. We have listened quite a lot to others, particularly community groups whose emphasis has been more on soft regeneration. Education, the social care in their area, the health service in their area. I wonder, Minister, you've said already that you are looking at regeneration across all policy areas. Will the government commit to ensuring that these soft areas, which can make a huge difference in communities, will be looked at as hard as the hard project-driven new building or refurb building projects, which we've heard so much about?
Absolutely. I think we have to look at both. I mean, I don't think you can do one without the other. I think you have to look at both in a community. It has to be a holistic service. It has to be a holistic approach. So yes, and I think that's why we are putting more emphasis now on the community-led, because it wasn't so apparent before. But yes, absolutely critical, but we need both. We still have to look at make sure the areas, the environments looks good, that towns are welcoming, that people want to move into towns, want to come into communities, because part of well-being is the area around you.
Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just got a couple of final questions, Minister. The first one just is regarding also the URCs. And also they have been one of the key initiatives of the previous Scottish Executive and also now the Scottish Government. Kind of one of the points, kind of questions I've got regarding them is kind of, will they continue to be sustained so that they can actually meet their targets? And what lessons to date have actually been learned from their activity, and also will there be any further URCs?
Well, I'll answer the last one first, because I think it's the easiest one to answer. I mean, I can't say here categorically, this Scottish Government has no plans to have further URCs. I can't talk for into the future, or whether local authorities want to set one up as a special purpose vehicle that's not funded by the Scottish Government. So I'd say that bit of it. I think there are some lessons that can be learned. I think the plans for URCs at the time were very ambitious. I think we had looked at and perhaps the targets were even more ambitious that they set, that if we could look now, what we know now, without, we didn't see the market failure, the recession, we didn't see all of that happening, and that wasn't anticipated when they were set up. So I think it's about being more flexible with we could have been, and they have got some flexibility now, but I think the Scottish Government has said that the funding, the large pots of funding for URCs is no longer going to be there, because that's now gone on to the Regeneration Capital Grant Fund. There will be some core funding for, I think, up to 2016, correct with that, for the core funding for the URCs, with the expectation that they can apply for the Regeneration Community Grant Fund. There's other sources of funding that they can look for, European funding, Jessica funding, to take their plan through. URCs were always a long-term project that the government would pump prime at the start. And I think, you know, we've done our bit in that, and they are looking to moving forward without the same support from the government as they've had in the past.
One of the points that Manson from Clyde Gateway mentioned earlier on was regarding the remediation costs, and he estimated it was up to about £80 million in his area, and we're going to get the written details from the URC representatives after today. They think with hindsight that when the URCs were set up, there was an underestimation of actually the costs that were required to get land into a shape where private developers actually would want to come in and then take on and build and then progress that area.
I think that's what I said. If we had the hindsight, if we had the knowledge that we have now, when the URCs were set up, it might have been done differently. But you know, we are where we are with them, and I think it is about just the Scottish Government's support to them is now being reduced considerably.
And final question, Convener, just it's an issue regarding the EU state aid regulations, and we've received evidence of community projects kind of being derailed by the threat of EU state aid regulations, and it can be difficult to believe that these regulations are aimed at projects of this nature. Certainly one witness described the response to the regulations by officers as duck and cover. Will you be able to provide a clear lead to ensure that state aid regulations are not an inhibition to community projects?
I think I'd say two things on that. I wouldn't want state aid to be an inhibition to community projects, nor would I want to see community projects falling foul of it, as I understand they have done not in Scotland, but I think there have been cases where they've fallen foul of state aid. So I've certainly spoken to officials. Officials have spoken to other departments about this. We are aware it's an issue for some community groups, and are looking at getting the Scottish setting up a group with the Scottish Government, State Aid Department, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and the Scottish Community Alliance to look at ways of how we can best advise community groups and state aid. It is complex. It's not complex just for community groups, it's complex full stop, the state aid, but looking at ways to ensure that it's not an inhibition to them and they're not sort of just turned down with the word state aid, you know, and that just puts the group off. That's what I wouldn't want to see. So we're aware that there's an issue there and are trying to see what we can do to assist.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Minister, one of the things which we've found as we've been going around the country is evidence that maybe some regeneration communities are not getting enough money out of the mainstream budget pot. Certainly in some local authorities, people have said that they are not getting the same level of service or the same money spent on services in their community compared to some other communities that are not designated as regeneration communities. How can we ensure that regeneration monies are not being used as a cash cow by other bodies so that they don't have to spend mainstream monies and are using monies which should be primarily used for additional things to regenerate communities?
In terms of local authority settlement, I'm not quite sure.
I'm talking about, well, I'll give an example. Environmental services, street cleaning, where maybe in a leafy suburb there's much more intensive service, much more street sweepers, a better litter bin collection than there is in a regeneration community. And I think it could be argued in terms of mainstream budgeting, and certainly some folk out there have argued in terms of mainstream budgeting, there seems to be direction of travel away in certain areas of spend from regeneration communities.
Well, on that one, Convener, what I would say is that I do think that with the step change to community planning partnerships, is about focusing on the disadvantaged areas and the areas of inequality and gearing their services around that. Now, how, if you're asking me as the Minister for Housing and Welfare, how we can sort that, but I think it is about looking, are they focusing on that? Are they accountable to their community? And are the communities that are not getting the services that you're mentioning there, are they as vocal in getting their services? Because that's sometimes an issue as well, and I think that's part of the sort of capacity building in community that we're looking at doing, is community capacity, making people aware of what community planning partnerships about, what local government is about, and it is about communities and improving the lives of people in the most disadvantaged areas, as well as providing services to those that don't.
So building capacity to allow local communities to scrutinise much more.
I believe they should. I believe that communities should be empowered to be able to look at that and hold their local government to account properly. I do think that communities have to do that. Very often it's the case it's the most vocal or the most articulate that get the most services, and it's about looking at how can we encourage everyone to be part of that and make sure that their voice is heard as well. And I think we have to try and promote that.
Thank you, Minister. Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Your question there reminds me of a comment that was made in Castlemoke in the early 90s, that they wished they had a royal visit every week because the streets would get swept every week. But the question I wanted to ask, Minister, is we have had 30 to 40 years worth of regeneration projects, and I worked in Castlemoke, and as I said, in the late 80s, early 90s on the New Life for Urban Scotland. Minister, does your department or the Scottish Government collate information as to how beneficial these regeneration projects have been in lifting the bottom 5%, those most in deprivation, out of deprivation? And is that a consideration when the government are making decisions about where to direct regeneration resources? Because we don't seem to be able to gather the information, or nobody seems to collate the information or provide the information to say that the worst 5% in the Scottish Index for multiple deprivation have been lifted out of deprivation because of the regeneration projects that have been carried out to the communities.
I mean, I think there are some examples of that, but regeneration and economic development is essentially devolved to local government and to community planning partnerships, and to look at that. So, and if a group moves out the deprivation index, another 5 groups move in. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but there's always going to be a bottom 5%, and it's been ensuring it's not the same 5% or the same ones as in the bottom in every occasion. But I think there are some areas where, because of regeneration, I think I might be right in saying in Bridgeton could be one of them. I'm not sure, because I visited the projects in Bridgeton, and some of the stuff done by Clyde Gateway involving communities as well, where a community which was very well, was very low down in the deprivation data zones has moved up. But in terms of, that's what local authorities and community planning partnerships should be looking at. It is about tackling the deprivation, and it's about ensuring that inequality is reduced. But there's always going to be data zones, and there's always going to be a bottom 5% and a top 5%, and it's so if some move up, what's happened to ones that are moving down? We need to look at that.
And the audience was nodding his head, Minister. Mr Wilson?
I was just going to say that the issue in terms of areas of multiple deprivation and whether or not they've benefited from some of the schemes, and I think you're quite right, you can identify an area such as Bridgeton. Is the issue about the areas of multiple deprivation an indicator in the single outcome agreements? And if it's not an indicator in the single outcome agreements, should it be an indicator in the single outcome agreements in these local authorities where we do see the persistent areas of multiple deprivation? And with the exception of Bridgeton, if you go a mile along the roads, you'll find out that some of the people in those areas, round about Parkhead, some of the communities in Parkhead have not benefited as much as possibly Bristol has benefited?
I mean, it's up to local authorities to determine within the scale of indicators which indicators they want to move to get to achieve what they're looking to achieve. I'll maybe ask David to say a bit more on this, but it is up to local authorities to look at, to know their area and the community planning partnerships in particular, and if they are strengthened and are working well, they should be looking at that very closely and looking at what indicators they want to see to make sure that people are actually, it's always been difficult, the soft indicators are the things that are, the well-being of an individual is something that is always been regarded as quite difficult to actually measure. Is that person, has their lifestyle improved? You know, or they might say they have, but how do you actually measure some of that? And they've got to look at that, but it is about actual getting outcomes now, and we'd be looking to see that. I don't know if you want to say something about the bottom data zones, David.
Well, I've just say, I mean, community planning partnerships do set their own priorities, and they choose the indicators that they will then measure progress by. Is very much for them. I've just gone through the process of setting single outcome agreements, which were signed off by council leaders and Scottish Government. Also, those single outcome agreements went through a peer review process. So, I suppose it's as I say, it's up to them to decide. Certainly, all the messaging through the community planning partnerships is that they should be looking at areas of multiple deprivation and taking steps to improve them.
Thank you very much. Can I thank you very much, Mr Cowan and Minister, for your evidence today. I now suspend this meeting and we'll move into private session.